This morning, I woke up to find my cat sitting on my chest, staring at me with her usual, "You're late feeding me" glare. Nothing unusual there, except that she was holding what looked like a scroll. A tiny scroll. She batted it toward me like it was a half-dead mouse she was particularly proud of, then meowed, which I swear sounded suspiciously like "read it." I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and unrolled the scroll. The handwriting was elegant and sharp, like it had been written by someone who took ink and quills very seriously. It read, "Dear resident of the dimension known as Earth Standard, your presence is requested in the Otherware Court for an emergency hearing. Attendance is mandatory, as decided by unanimous meow. Regards, the Parliament of Felines." I blinked, looked at my cat, whose expression had not changed, and decided I probably wasn't awake yet. "Sure, buddy. The Parliament. What's next, raccoons in suits?" My cat, apparently tired of my skepticism, swatted the scroll from my hand, jumped to the floor, and began pawing at what looked like a shadow on the wall. A shadow that should not have been there. A moment later, the shadow expanded, folding in on itself like origami, and became a door. A literal glowing door, complete with tiny brass hinges and a doorknob shaped like a cat's paw. Now, I could have ignored it. I should have ignored it. But the door opened on its own, and the space beyond it was so absurdly inviting that I couldn't help myself. It looked like a Victorian library, if said library had been designed by a whimsical fever dream. Shelves spiraled upward in impossible directions, holding not just books but also jars of stars, floating fish bowls, and what appeared to be a violin made of candy. Before I could take it all in, I felt a tug on my pajama pants. My cat was sitting by the doorway, tail swishing impatiently. "Fine," I muttered, stepping through. "What's the worst that could happen?" As soon as I crossed the threshold, the door vanished, and I found myself standing in the middle of an enormous courtroom. Or maybe it was a theater. Honestly, it felt like both. Cats were everywhere. Dozens of them, sitting on plush cushions arranged in rows like jury seats, their tails curled neatly around their bodies. Some wore tiny monocles. Others sported elaborate collars, bow ties, or tiny crowns. One particularly large tabby was lounging on what looked suspiciously like a throne. The cat on the throne, who I later learned was Chief Justice Whiskerbottom, raised a paw, and the room fell silent. "The accused has arrived," it declared, its voice deep and resonant, like Morgan Freeman in cat form. "Accused?" I said, forgetting for a moment that I was talking to a room full of cats. "Yes," purred a sleek black cat with eyes like green marbles. It perched on a desk to my left, where an absurdly large gavel rested. "You stand charged with violating the pact of indoor-outdoor harmony." "I what?" I sputtered. "I don't even know what that is." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, soft meows and occasional hisses, until Whiskerbottom raised a paw again. "Silence," it commanded, then turned its piercing gaze on me. "Do you deny keeping the door closed when your feline companion requested to go outside? Do you deny withholding tuna for no discernible reason? Do you deny attempting to bathe a cat?" Oh no, the betrayal. My own cat had ratted me out to a cosmic court of cats. I thought I was doing what was best. I stammered. "It's not safe outside, and the tuna thing was because you threw up last time, and the bath, okay, yeah, the bath was a bad idea." The jury cats leaned in, eyes narrowing. A fluffy white Persian in a tiara made a dramatic choking sound, as though I'd personally offended her ancestors. The tension in the room was palpable. Somewhere in the back, a Siamese hissed, and I'm pretty sure I saw a kitten faint into a pile of cushions. The black cat with the gavel spoke again. "Do you have any defense, human?" My mind raced. "I love her." It came out as a question, which didn't help. "I just want her to be happy and safe, and okay, fine, I'll buy more tuna." This seemed to calm the jury. A ginger cat in a bowler hat gave a solemn nod. Whiskerbottom leaned forward. "Your words are noted. However, actions speak louder than meows." I braced for a sentence involving eternal cat litter duty or some kind of karmic hairball curse. But instead, the throne room filled with light. The glowing door appeared again behind me, swinging open with a soft creak. You will be returned to your realm, Whiskerbottom said. But heed this warning, the Parliament is always watching. Treat your feline companion as they deserve, or face our judgment once more. Before I could respond, my cat jumped through the door, tail held high. I followed, and just like that, I was back in my living room. The scroll was gone. The mysterious door was gone. My cat, however, was perched on the couch, staring at me like nothing had happened. And yet, on the kitchen counter, there was a new can of tuna. I don't even remember buying it. So I have to ask, if your pet dragged you into a magical courtroom where they'd secretly been plotting your trial, what crimes do you think they'd charge you with? And how would you defend yourself? Let's start a new story. When I first met Charlie, I thought he was one of those serious people. You know the type. Wears the same neutral colored jacket every day, keeps his headphones in even when he's not listening to anything, and doesn't bother with pleasantries because small talk is apparently beneath him. He was my upstairs neighbor, and our first interaction didn't do much to change my impression. It was a rainy Thursday morning, and I was running late for work. I had both hands full, one balancing a precarious tower of Tupperware, the other gripping a completely impractical polka dot umbrella that refused to stay open. As I struggled down the building's narrow staircase, I collided with Charlie, who was coming up. My lunch exploded all over the landing. Soup, salad, and what I swear was an entire colony of baby tomatoes rolling in every direction. Charlie stared at the mess, then at me. "You should get better lids," he said flatly. No apology, no offer to help. Just those 4 words before he sidestepped the chaos and continued up the stairs. To say I was unimpressed would be an understatement. I spent the rest of the week avoiding him, grumbling to anyone who would listen about my antisocial upstairs neighbor. "He's like a robot," I told my best friend over drinks. Not even a cool robot, like one that makes coffee. Just a boring one, like a calculator. Then came the fire alarm incident. It was a Sunday evening, and I was mid-binge watch of a guilty pleasure reality show when the alarm shrieked to life. I grabbed my keys and shuffled downstairs in my pajamas, fully expecting it to be a false alarm, as it always was. Most of the building had the same resigned expression, standing around in the parking lot like sleepy, irritable sheep. But not Charlie. No, Charlie was sprinting back and forth between his car and the entrance, carrying what looked like buckets of water. I stood there, baffled, until someone whispered, "He's trying to save the cat." The cat, Mrs. Feldman's ancient, cantankerous Siamese cat who only came out at night to hiss at people. Apparently, she'd been napping when the alarm went off, and Charlie, of all people, had taken it upon himself to rescue her. Watching him coax the shrieking furball into his arms was like witnessing someone wrestle an angry cloud, but somehow he managed it. When he emerged triumphant, covered in scratches, Mrs. Feldman clapped like he'd won a gold medal. "Why did you even bother?" I asked him later, genuinely curious. His face didn't change, same neutral expression as always, but he said, "It's not the cat's fault people can't cook." Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with an entirely new, uncomfortable feeling about Charlie. Things kept unraveling after that. Once you start paying attention to someone, you notice more than you mean to, like how he always held the elevator door, even when he clearly didn't want to, or how he watered the sad, half-dead plants in the lobby without telling anyone, or how he spent every other Saturday morning in the communal laundry room teaching Mr. Patel, the elderly tenant from 4B, how to use his smartphone. And then there was the bread. One night, I came home to find a small loaf of freshly baked sourdough sitting on my doorstep, wrapped in parchment paper with my name scribbled on it. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but when I looked up, there he was, Charlie, standing at the top of the stairs. "You dropped your mail yesterday," he said, as if that explained everything. Then, without another word, he disappeared into his apartment. I didn't eat the bread right away. I stared at it, suspicious, until hunger got the better of me. When I finally took a bite, it was perfect, like bakery-level perfect. The next day, I caught him by the mailboxes. "Did you make that?" I asked, waving a crumb-dusted piece of parchment at him. He shrugged. "It's just bread." But his ears turned red when he said it. After that, the dynamic shifted. Charlie wasn't just that serious guy upstairs anymore. He became Charlie, The guy who made bread and saved cats and occasionally let himself be talked into awkward small talk about the weather. It turned out he was funny in a dry, understated way, the kind of funny that sneaks up on you and leaves you laughing at random moments hours later. He had this encyclopedic knowledge of birds, for reasons I still don't fully understand, and once spent 20 minutes explaining the courtship dance of the Western grebe to me while we both waited for takeout. We started hanging out in little ways, sharing beers on the front stoop, swapping random facts about nothing, sending each other memes over text. I learned that his stoic exterior was more of a shield than anything else, and that underneath it was someone who cared about people so much it almost embarrassed him. He hated asking for help, but never hesitated to give it. He pretended not to notice things, but he noticed everything. The moment I realized I was in trouble came on an ordinary Tuesday. We were sitting on the steps, sharing a bag of kettle chips, when he suddenly pointed at the sky and said, "Look, a kestrel." I looked up, and all I saw was a smudge with wings. But he kept watching, describing its dive with this quiet intensity that made my chest feel like it was being squeezed. It wasn't just the bird he cared about, it was everything. Every tiny, beautiful, overlooked thing in the world. I didn't say anything that night, but when I went to bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about how wrong I'd been, and how much better my life was now that I'd let him in. So, have you ever been completely wrong about someone at first? Let's start a new story. It happened in the middle of a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day where you're just floating between tasks without much purpose. I was on my lunch break, wandering through a park near my office, clutching a lukewarm coffee and a pre-packaged sandwich that was more plastic than food. The park was mostly empty, just a few dog walkers and a couple of kids kicking a ball. I wasn't paying attention to much of anything until I saw him. He was maybe 8 or 9 years old, perched on the edge of the fountain like a king surveying his kingdom. His red raincoat was comically oversized, flapping around him like he'd borrowed it from a giant. What caught my attention wasn't the coat or even the fact that he was tossing bits of bread into the water for the pigeons. It was the method, the deliberate, almost theatrical way he did it. He'd tear off a piece, hold it out dramatically, and wait. Not just a quick toss, but a full pause, like he was offering an ancient treasure to an invisible force. Then, with an exaggerated flourish, he'd lob the bread into the water, watching it sink or float with intense fascination. I couldn't look away. As I got closer, I saw what he was doing. He wasn't just feeding pigeons or ducks. He was testing the bread. Specifically, he was watching which pieces floated and which ones sank. After every toss, he'd mutter something under his breath, then scribble furiously into a small notebook balanced on his knee. I walked past him slowly, trying to be inconspicuous, but he must have noticed me staring. Without looking up, he said, "Whole wheat sinks faster." "Sorry, what?" I stopped mid-step. "Whole wheat bread," he repeated, turning to me. His face was earnest, serious in a way that felt far older than his years. "It sinks faster than white bread. I'm testing it." He gestured toward the notebook as if this explained everything. "Why?" I asked, genuinely curious. He sighed dramatically, the way only kids can when faced with an adult who clearly doesn't get it. "Because," he said, "what if you needed to send a message underwater? You'd need to know which bread to use." I blinked. "Messages underwater?" "Yeah," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Like for spies. Or mermaids. Or, I don't know, fish that need bread notes. Someone has to figure it out." At this point, I couldn't decide if he was the weirdest or most brilliant kid I'd ever met. Maybe both. But instead of laughing or brushing him off, I found myself sitting down on the fountain ledge next to him. "And whole wheat sinks faster?" I asked, trying to keep a straight face. "Yeah," he said, pushing a soggy piece into the water with a stick. "But it gets mushy faster, too. White bread floats, but sometimes it breaks apart. Rye's okay, but it depends on the brand." He handed me a crust of something dense and dark. "Try it." So there I was, a grown adult in business casual, throwing bread into a fountain on my lunch break under the guidance of a tiny bread scientist. I tossed the piece in, and sure enough, it hovered for a moment before sinking with a satisfying plop. The kid nodded solemnly, as though this confirmed a deep truth about the universe. "What's the verdict on rye?" I asked. Still testing, he said, scribbling another note. But it might be the best for shallow messages. Like if you're in a pond and not the ocean. Good to know, I said, completely swept up in his strange little world. For the next 10 minutes, we sat there, tossing bread, watching it float or sink, and speculating about underwater espionage and the communication needs of aquatic life. It was ridiculous and surreal and absolutely magical. Eventually, I glanced at my watch and realized my break was over. I should get back to work, I said, standing up reluctantly. But, good luck with your research. Thanks, he said, looking up at me with a grin. If I figure out the perfect bread, I'll let you know. As I walked back to the office, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The sheer creativity of it. The way he'd taken something as mundane as feeding birds and turned it into a full-blown experiment in espionage and imagination. I thought about how, as adults, we're so quick to dismiss these moments, to file them away as nonsense instead of diving into them head first. When was the last time I'd looked at something ordinary and thought, what if? The rest of the day felt lighter somehow, like I'd been let in on a secret. I didn't tell anyone at work about the kid or the bread experiment, but every time I saw someone staring blankly at their computer screen, I wanted to shake them and say, hey, what if you could send messages to mermaids? That night, I stopped by the store and picked up a loaf of rye bread. Not for testing. I'm not quite there yet. But just to have in my kitchen as a reminder that the world is full of ridiculous, wonderful possibilities if you're willing to sit down by a fountain and pay attention. So, what about you? Have you ever had one of those moments where the ordinary turned into something extraordinary just because you let your imagination run wild? I'd love to hear about it. Who knows? Maybe your story will inspire the next great breakthrough in underwater messaging systems. Let's start a new story. The day I accidentally joined the Owl Club began with a bad decision at a roadside antique shop. I was driving home from a wedding. The kind of wedding where you're seated next to someone's great-aunt who spends 2 hours critiquing the bride's dress and needed a distraction to shake off the whole ordeal. So when I saw the hand-painted sign that said Wonders Within, Antiques and Oddities, I pulled over because who doesn't love a little oddity on a Sunday afternoon? The place was a chaos of dust and possibility. Stacks of mismatched books teetered like literary Jenga. Tables groaned under the weight of porcelain dolls, rusted tools, and unidentifiable trinkets. The air smelled like old wood and forgotten stories. I wandered aimlessly for a while, pretending I knew how to distinguish treasure from junk, until something caught my eye on a cluttered shelf. It was an owl, or more specifically, a tiny brass owl figurine no taller than my thumb. Its eyes were inset with small, red stones that glinted in the dim light, and it had a weight to it when I picked it up, like it had been carved out of something much older than brass. I didn't even like owls, really, but there was something about it, an odd, magnetic quality. The tag hanging from its neck said, for dollars. A bargain for mystery. The woman at the register looked at me like I'd just signed a pact. She was ancient, with a face like crumpled paper and eyes that seemed far too sharp for her age. Interesting choice, she said, her voice thick with what might have been amusement or warning. Before I could ask what she meant, she handed me a paper bag, and I left, eager to beat the setting sun home. That night, I set the owl on my windowsill, thinking it might be nice to have a piece of whimsy in my otherwise very unwhimsical apartment. By the time I went to bed, I'd mostly forgotten about it. Until 3:14 a.m., I woke up to the sound of tapping. At first, I thought it was rain, but when I opened my eyes, I realized it was coming from the window. Groggily, I turned on the bedside lamp and froze. Outside, perched on the fire escape, was an owl. A real, enormous owl with feathers the color of storm clouds and eyes like molten gold. It stared at me, unblinking, and tapped its beak against the glass again. My heart did the thing it does when a movie villain appears out of nowhere. And for a good minute, I just sat there staring back like a deer in existential headlights. Then, slowly, I got up and walked to the window. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't want to find out what would happen if I ignored it. When I opened the window, the owl didn't fly away. It didn't attack me, either, which felt like an equally viable option. Instead, it cocked its head and dropped something onto the windowsill. A tiny scroll, tied with a piece of red string. Then it flapped its wings and disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with what I was now convinced was some kind of wizard bird. I untied the scroll with shaking hands. The paper was thick, almost velvety, and covered in elegant handwriting that didn't look like it belonged to the modern world. It read, "Welcome. Meeting at midnight. Bring the owl." You know which one. There was no signature, no explanation, just those cryptic words. I spent the next 20 minutes pacing my apartment, half convinced I was in the middle of a fever dream. But the figurine sat there on the windowsill, smug and silent, like it had been waiting for this moment all along. Midnight found me standing in an overgrown park on the edge of town, clutching the brass owl in one hand and my pepper spray in the other. I wasn't sure what I expected, probably some elaborate prank or, worst case, a cult recruitment, but what I found was weirder. A circle of people stood in a clearing, all holding owl figurines like mine. Some were brass, others wood or glass or stone, but each one had the same uncanny presence. No one spoke. They just nodded at me as I approached, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of paper lanterns hanging from tree branches. At the center of the circle was an altar, or maybe a table, depending on how much you wanted to romanticize it, covered in an assortment of oddities: feathers, candles, an ancient-looking book. And behind it all, the owl from my fire escape sat perched on a branch, watching like it was in charge. Before I could ask what was happening, an older man in a tweed coat stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Welcome, new keeper," he said, his voice carrying a solemnity that made my stomach flip. "You have been chosen by the owl to join our ranks." "Your ranks?" I asked, gripping my figurine tighter. "We are the Watchers," he said, like that explained anything. "Protectors of the unseen, guardians of the in-between." He gestured to the brass owl in my hand. "Each of us has been entrusted with an artifact. You are now part of this legacy." I was too stunned to laugh, which is probably why I didn't get kicked out on the spot. Instead, I listened as they explained bits and pieces of lore that sounded like something out of a Neil Gaiman novel. There was talk of balance and shadows, of protecting the world from forces that most people would never notice. It was absurd and fascinating and oddly comforting, like stepping into a story that had been waiting for me all along. I still don't know if I believe everything they said. Maybe it's just a group of eccentrics playing at mysticism. Or maybe that owl on my fire escape was more than just a bird. All I know is that the brass owl still sits on my windowsill, and every now and then, when the world feels a little too heavy, I hear a faint tapping at the glass. So, have you ever stumbled into something so strange it felt like fate was pulling the strings, even if you weren't sure you believed in it? Let's start a new story. The rain had just stopped, and the pavement was still slick, reflecting the bruised purple of the evening sky. I was walking back from the bus stop, juggling an umbrella that didn't need to be open anymore and the unwieldy bag of oranges I'd impulsively bought because they were on sale. The air smelled like wet concrete and something faintly metallic, and all I could think about was how badly I wanted to get home, kick off my shoes, and not think for a while. Then I saw it. It was tucked into the corner of a small, dingy storefront, a claw machine. Not the sleek, LED-lit ones you see in malls or arcades now, but one of those old, slightly rusted ones with the chipped plastic panels and neon letters that buzz faintly when they light up. The kind of machine that looks like it's been sitting there forever, ignored, waiting for someone to notice it. The umbrella slipped from my hand as I stared at it. Something about the sight of that machine stirred something deep inside me, like an itch I hadn't realized was there. I didn't even know why. It wasn't particularly remarkable, just a forgotten relic shoved into the corner of a convenience store that had seen better days. But it stopped me in my tracks all the same. I stepped closer, peering through the grimy glass at the toys piled haphazardly inside. There were the usual suspects: neon-colored stuffed animals, cheap plastic trinkets, and a rubbery octopus with googly eyes. But at the very back, almost buried under a mound of knockoff Pokemon plushies, I saw it. A red yo-yo. It wasn't just any yo-yo. It was my yo-yo. Well, not literally, of course, but it was the same model, the same shade of fire engine red, with the same silver emblem stamped on the side. I hadn't thought about that yo-yo in years, but the second I saw it, I was 11 again, sitting on the cracked steps of my grandparents' porch with that yo-yo swinging from my finger. It had been a gift from my grandpa, one of those spur-of-the-moment purchases he was famous for. Because every kid needs a good yo-yo, he'd said, handing it to me with a grin. I'd spent an entire summer perfecting tricks with it. Walk the dog, around the world, even the elusive rock the baby. I carried it everywhere, the string always tangled in my pocket, until one day it vanished, as things from childhood tend to do. I didn't even realize how much I'd missed it until that moment. I stepped into the store, the bell above the door jangling as I entered. The clerk barely glanced up from his phone as I approached the machine, rummaging in my bag for change. I found a few quarters rattling around at the bottom and fed them into the slot, the machine springing to life with a low hum. The claw was as clunky as I remembered, jerky and imprecise, but I maneuvered it toward the yo-yo with a determination that felt almost absurd. My first attempt was a disaster. The claw grabbed nothing but air before limping back to the start. I fed in another quarter, then another. By the fifth try, I was starting to question my sanity. I wasn't even sure why I cared so much. It wasn't like the yo-yo was actually mine, but it felt like it could be. Like if I could just get it, I'd be reclaiming some small piece of myself that I didn't even know I'd lost. On the seventh try, the claw finally caught the edge of the yo-yo. I held my breath as it lifted, wobbling precariously as if it might fall at any second. But it didn't. It dropped the yo-yo into the chute with a satisfying clunk, and I let out a laugh, sharp and unguarded, like I hadn't heard from myself in years. I reached into the chute and pulled it out, turning it over in my hands. It was lighter than I remembered, the paint slightly chipped, but it was perfect. I stood there for a moment, clutching the yo-yo like it was a treasure, feeling 11 years old and invincible all over again. On my way out, the clerk looked up and gave me a curious smile. "Lucky," he said, nodding at the yo-yo. "Yeah," I said, grinning back. Something like that. The rain had started again by the time I stepped outside, but I didn't care. I stuffed the yo-yo into my pocket and walked home with a spring in my step, my bag of oranges swinging at my side. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment. The yo-yo string looped around my finger, trying to remember the tricks I'd mastered all those years ago. My muscle memory was rusty, but with each swing and spin, it started to come back. And as I watched the yo-yo arc through the air, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Joy. Simple, unfiltered, unapologetic joy. It wasn't just about the yo-yo. It was about remembering a version of myself I'd almost forgotten. The kid who believed in magic, who spent whole afternoons chasing it with nothing but a yo-yo and a little bit of string. Have you ever had a moment like that? When something small and unexpected pulled you back to a time you didn't even realize you missed. Let's start a new story. I found the key on a day when the universe seemed to be working against me. It was one of those relentless mornings where every small thing goes wrong in ways so specific it feels personal. My coffee machine spat out sludge instead of coffee. My favorite shirt had somehow shrunk in the wash, and I dropped my phone, mercifully unbroken, on the way out the door. By the time I got to work, I felt like a walking cliche of bad luck and frazzled nerves. Lunch was no better. I'd ordered a salad to be healthy, but it arrived drenched in some syrupy dressing that made it inedible. Instead of complaining, I just pushed it aside, sulking at my desk. That's when I decided I needed a break, a proper one. So I left the office, wandered aimlessly, and ended up in a little thrift shop I'd passed 100 times but never gone inside. It wasn't planned. It was just there. The place smelled like dust and old wood, the kind of smell that hangs in the air like a question. Shelves crammed with knickknacks, racks of out-of-date clothing, crates of records no one had listened to in decades. I had no intention of buying anything. I just needed to be somewhere that wasn't my desk. And then I saw it. It was hanging from a small hook near the register, a tarnished brass key attached to a chain. The tag said $2 scrawled in faded black marker. There was nothing special about it at first glance, just an ordinary key with a long, thin shaft and a decorative bow. But something about it made me stop. It felt heavy, somehow, like it was more than just an object. On impulse, I bought it. When I got back to the office, I looped the chain around my neck and let the key dangle just below my collarbone. I didn't think much of it until later that afternoon, when my computer froze during a meeting and I instinctively reached up to touch the key, turning it over in my fingers like a worry stone. That's when it happened. The world flickered, not in a dramatic, movie-like way. It was more like a subtle shift, a shimmer at the edges of reality. Suddenly, I wasn't in my office anymore. I was standing in my grandmother's backyard. Not a memory of it, the real thing. The grass was cool under my bare feet, and the air smelled of lilacs and freshly mowed lawns. The old oak tree towered above me, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. I could hear the faint hum of cicadas, the distant bark of a dog, and the soft clink of my grandmother's wind chimes. I stood there, stunned, until I heard her voice. "You're just in time," she called from the back porch, waving a hand in her gardening gloves. She looked exactly as I remembered her. Rosy cheeks, hair pinned up in a way that always looked effortless. She held up a basket of ripe tomatoes, beaming with pride. "Look at these beauties. Perfect for dinner." It was so real I wanted to cry. But before I could speak, the world flickered again, and I was back at my desk. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the muted chatter of the office filling the air. My fingers still clutched the key. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus. I left work early, rushing home with the key burning against my chest. I needed to know if it would happen again, and it did. The second time, I was on the playground from my old elementary school, the one they tore down years ago. I could feel the coarse wood of the jungle gym under my hands, hear the rhythmic creak of swings swaying in the wind. My younger self was there, laughing with my best friend, a girl I hadn't thought about in years. Each time I touched the key, it took me somewhere new. My childhood bedroom, bathed in the soft glow of my old lava lamp. The treehouse where I used to read for hours, the smell of damp wood and crayon lingering in the air. Even my first apartment, with its mismatched furniture and leaky faucet, felt alive again. But the most incredible part was the way it made me feel. These weren't just places. They were pieces of me I'd forgotten, fragments of time that felt impossibly distant until they weren't. Each flicker brought back a warmth, a fullness, like I was reconnecting with the best parts of myself. It was intoxicating. Still, there was a weight to it. The more I used the key, the more I began to notice small details that weren't quite right. A book out of place on a shelf, a crack in a wall that hadn't been there before. The flickers lasted longer, and sometimes, when I returned, I'd find myself sitting in a room with the faint scent of lilacs clinging to my skin. One night, I flickered back to the backyard again. My grandmother was sitting on the porch, the basket of tomatoes at her feet. She smiled at me, but there was a sadness in her eyes this time. "Careful," she said softly. "You can't stay too long." I wanted to ask her why, but before I could, the world shifted again, and I was alone in my apartment. The key felt heavier now, its edges biting into my palm. I still have it. I don't use it as often as I did at first, but every once in a while, on a day when the world feels particularly sharp, I'll reach for it and let it take me back. Not to escape, but to remember, to hold on to the pieces of myself that might otherwise slip away. So now I have to ask, if you found a key that could take you back, even for a moment, would you use it? And if you did, where would it take you? Let's start a new story. The first thing you should know about me is that I have a terrible memory for faces. It's not a medical condition, just this weird, selective mental blind spot. But when I have a crush on someone, their face gets burned into my mind, like my brain hits record every time they smile or laugh, or I don't know, sip coffee like a human being. And then the really weird part starts. I start seeing them everywhere. Not literally them, but echoes of them, like my brain has sprinkled little breadcrumbs of their essence across the universe. For example, there's a girl I've been into lately. Let's call her Mia. We met at a mutual friend's party a few weeks ago, and ever since then, she's been this little sunbeam lighting up the back corners of my mind. She has this way of talking that's both earnest and completely offbeat, like she's figured out a secret language where everything is funny but also meaningful. The night we met, she told me she thinks turtles are the punk rockers of the animal kingdom. Don't ask me to explain. I just nodded and fell halfway in love. Anyway, now that Mia's made herself at home in my brain, I keep spotting pieces of her in random places. The other day, I was in line at the grocery store when a woman ahead of me laughed. It wasn't Mia's laugh. It was deeper, scratchier, but it had this shape to it that reminded me of her. Like an echo of something I'd forgotten I loved. I had to stop myself from saying, "Hey, do you know Mia?" Because imagine how that conversation would have gone. And it's not just people. I'll see a color, this golden yellow shade on an old car, for instance, and think Mia would wear that. Or I'll hear a song on the radio and feel absolutely certain that it's her favorite, even though she's never mentioned music to me. Once I walked past a bakery and caught a whiff of cinnamon, and for no logical reason, I thought Mia would smell like this if she were a dessert. Okay, that one's weird, but you get the idea. These aren't normal crush thoughts. Normal people think about texting their crush or what to wear if they run into them. My brain? It's like, what if Mia's entire essence is secretly encoded in the smell of fresh pastries? It's gotten to the point where my imagination has started warping reality. Like I was at a cafe last week, sitting by the window with my laptop, when I saw someone walk by outside wearing a big floppy hat. It wasn't Mia's hat. It wasn't even her style. But for one bizarre moment, I was sure it was her. My heart did that stupid thing where it stumbles over itself. And I got this burst of adrenaline like, she's here. Fate is real. I was halfway out of my chair before I realized the woman was twice Mia's age and walking a Pomeranian in a sweater. Not Mia. Not fate. Just my ridiculous brain making connections where none exist. You'd think this would be a bad thing. Living in a reality where crushes turn into these surreal scavenger hunts. And yes, sometimes it's exhausting. Like when I saw a sticker of a cartoon turtle on a lamppost last Tuesday and spent the rest of the day wondering if it was some cosmic sign meant for me. Spoiler, it wasn't. It was an ad for a pet store. But honestly, I kind of love it. It's like having this secret filter over the world where everything feels a little brighter, a little more magical. Mia isn't even around, but she's everywhere at the same time. And maybe that's what having a crush is supposed to feel like, a gentle haunting, like your heart is whispering, pay attention. There's beauty in the smallest things. I've been trying to work up the courage to ask Mia out. Every time I see her name pop up in my messages, my chest does that fluttery thing like it's a bird trapped in a shoebox. I keep replaying conversations in my head, picturing her expressions like they're paintings in a gallery only I can visit. She has this way of looking at you when she's listening, like you're saying something important even when you're not. I want to tell her about the echoes, about how she's become this quiet presence in my everyday life. But that sounds like something a poet would say, not me. I don't want to weird her out. Not yet anyway. Instead, I text her a meme about turtles. It's stupid and funny, and I know she'll laugh because it's so her sense of humor. She sends back a voice message, a short, 3-second laugh, and it's exactly the sound I heard at the grocery store. Not an echo this time. The real thing. And just like that, I feel a little less haunted and a lot more alive. So, what about you? Do you have any secret habits when it comes to crushes? Or ways the universe starts to feel a little weirder when someone special sneaks into your life? Please tell me I'm not the only one out here being haunted by imaginary signs and symbolic turtles. Let's start a new story. I'll tell you a story, but I'm not sure you'll believe me. It started on a rainy Thursday, one of those days where the clouds seem to be made of lead and even the air feels gray. I was in line at a coffee shop that I never go to. My regular one had mysteriously closed early for maintenance, a handwritten sign taped crookedly to the door. I remember being annoyed because the rain had soaked through my shoes, and this unfamiliar cafe was taking forever to make a simple latte. The line crawled forward. The man in front of me was muttering something about a canceled meeting and fiddling with a pen in his hand. When he got to the counter, the pen slipped from his fingers and rolled backward, bumping into my foot. I picked it up to hand it back, and that's when I noticed it wasn't a normal pen. It was sleek, almost too smooth, with a metallic finish that shimmered in a way that didn't quite match the dim lighting. There was an engraving along the barrel, so faint I had to squint to read it. To the writer of things unseen. You dropped this, I said, holding it out to him. He glanced down at it, then at me, and for a moment his face twisted into something like confusion. That's not mine, he said. I've never seen it before. I stood there awkwardly, holding the pen as the barista called him up to the counter. He didn't take it. I could have left it on the counter, but instead, I slipped it into my pocket without thinking, figuring I'd deal with it later. The rest of the day was uneventful until I got home. As I tossed my bag onto the couch and kicked off my wet shoes, the pen tumbled out and rolled to a stop on the coffee table. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. Something about its weight was strange, almost too heavy for something so small. On a whim, I grabbed an old notebook from a drawer and uncapped the pen. The moment I touched the page, the pen came alive. It didn't just write. It moved as if it had a mind of its own, dragging my hand in smooth, fluid motions. Words spilled onto the page in handwriting that wasn't mine, looping and elegant. The door will open at midnight. I stared at the notebook, half expecting the ink to vanish like something out of a magic trick, but it stayed as solid and real as anything else in the room. Midnight. It wasn't a time that meant anything to me. I didn't have plans or secrets waiting to reveal themselves at the stroke of 12. Still, a little thrill ran up my spine. I set an alarm for 11:55 just in case. When it went off, the apartment was silent, the kind of deep quiet that feels heavier than the dark. I turned on a lamp, blinking against the harsh light, and waited. Nothing happened at first. Midnight came and went, and I felt a little silly sitting there with a pen clutched in one hand and a notebook in the other. Then, at 12:03, the doorbell rang. It startled me so much I almost dropped the pen. No one ever rang my doorbell at that hour. My heart hammered as I crossed the room, peeking through the peephole. There was no one there, just the soft glow of the hallway light. But when I opened the door, a folded piece of paper sat on the doormat. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and unfolded it. In the same looping handwriting, it read, "If you're ready, leave the pen at the fountain." The fountain. There was only one it could mean, a crumbling stone relic in the park near my apartment. I didn't think anyone else even noticed it. It was overgrown with moss, its basin long dry, and it sat at the edge of the park where no one really wandered. I should have ignored it, but the pen was still warm in my hand, almost pulsing with a quiet urgency. Without changing out of my pajamas, I threw on a coat, grabbed the pen, and headed out. The park was deserted, the kind of empty that makes your footsteps sound too loud. I found the fountain easily. Even in the dark, it seemed to call to me. As I approached, the air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. The moonlight cast long shadows across the stone, and in the middle of the basin sat a small, wooden box I'd never seen before. I hesitated. The note had told me to leave the pen, but it didn't say anything about the box. Curiosity won out. I climbed into the fountain, my shoes scraping against the stone, and picked it up. It wasn't locked, just a plain latch holding it closed. I flipped it open. Inside was a key. Not an ordinary one. This was old, ornate, with a handle shaped like a tree whose branches curled into loops and spirals. I held it up to the moonlight, and the moment I did, the pen in my pocket started to hum. I pulled it out, and before I could stop myself, it began writing in the notebook I'd brought. "Turn around." I froze, my breath catching. Slowly I turned. Behind me, the fountain had changed. The moss and cracks were gone, replaced by smooth, gleaming stone. Water spilled over its edges, sparkling like liquid light. And in the center of it, where the box had been, a door now stood. It was tall and arched, made of the same shimmering material as the pen, with the same engraving of a tree and a star. The key in my hand felt like it was vibrating, urging me forward. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the rain earlier, or the strange handwriting, or the fact that ordinary life suddenly felt impossibly small. I stepped forward, slotted the key into the door, and turned it. What was on the other side? That's harder to explain. Light, yes, but not just light. It was a world, or maybe a moment, that felt like stepping into the heart of a story, something bigger than me, with edges that stretched far beyond anything I'd ever known. The air smelled like ink and leaves, and the ground pulsed faintly beneath my feet. I could see pathways branching off into infinity, each one shimmering with possibility. And then, just like that, I was back in my apartment, the pen lying cold and still on my desk. The notebook was blank, the pages untouched. But in my pocket, I still had the key. I don't know what I unlocked, or why it chose me. But sometimes, late at night, I feel the weight of the key and wonder, what happens if I turn it again? Have you ever stumbled into something that felt like it wasn't meant for this world, but maybe, just maybe, it was meant for you? Let's start a new story. It wasn't the kind of day you'd expect to remember years later. Just a gray Tuesday in the middle of November. The sky's stuck in that in-between color where it can't decide if it wants to rain or not. I'd left work early for no particular reason, except that my brain felt foggy, like my thoughts had been wading through wet cement all morning. Walking aimlessly through the quieter side of town, I stumbled upon a thrift store I hadn't noticed before. The sign outside was faded, the letters almost invisible beneath peeling paint. It looked like the kind of place where time might accidentally get stuck. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and mothballs, and the lighting was dim, as though even the fluorescent bulbs had grown tired. I wandered through aisles cluttered with mismatched plates, tarnished jewelry, and teetering piles of forgotten books, until my hand brushed against something soft and familiar. It was a scarf. No, not just a scarf. It was the scarf. It was the exact shade of cobalt blue as the one my grandmother had knitted for me when I was 9. My fingers ran over the thick, uneven weave, and I swear I could feel her hands working the yarn, hear the gentle click of her needles. But it wasn't just the scarf itself. It was the scent, faint but unmistakable, that rose up when I brought it closer to my face. Lavender, mixed with the slightest hint of something metallic, like pennies left in the sun. My grandmother's smell. My chest tightened in a way I couldn't quite name, and I blinked hard, staring at the scarf as if it might blink back. When I was a kid, she used to wear a small lavender sachet pinned inside her coat, insisting it kept moths away. I remember thinking that made her magical somehow, like a fairy godmother who carried a pocket full of flowers. The scarf had been her first knitting project, or so she claimed, though I never quite believed her. It was too perfect for that, even with its occasional lopsided row. I wore it until the fibers thinned and unraveled, until my mother quietly tucked it away one winter when she thought I wouldn't notice. I stood there in that thrift store, clutching this ghost of a memory brought back to life. And for a moment, the weight of the years between us dissolved. I could see her sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, sunlight streaming in behind her as she worked, her mouth quirked in concentration. She'd hum while she knitted, not a song, really just a tune she made up as she went. I could hear it again, faint and far away, the notes dancing just beyond reach. Without thinking, I bought the scarf. It cost $2.15. The cashier didn't even look at it twice, but I felt like I'd stumbled onto something priceless. Walking home with it bundled under my arm, I felt lighter somehow, as though the November gloom had been cut through with a shard of blue sky. Later that evening, as I sat in my apartment, I spread the scarf across my lap and studied it more closely. It wasn't identical, of course. This one had a slightly different pattern, a different texture to the yarn. But the color, it was uncanny, the exact shade that existed only in the hazy, golden glow of my memory. I draped it around my neck and closed my eyes. And then it hit me, not a memory, but a sensation. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was in her kitchen, where everything smelled like buttered toast and something baking in the oven. I could feel the rough edge of her kitchen table against my arms, hear the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. She was there, pouring tea into 2 mismatched mugs, her hair pinned back in a way that always left stray wisps curling around her face. She wasn't speaking, but the air between us felt full of everything she'd ever said, her voice wrapping around me like the scarf itself. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't sure how long I'd been sitting there. The room felt smaller somehow, like her presence had lingered for just a second longer than it should have. I didn't want to move, afraid that even the slightest shift would break whatever spell had wrapped itself around me. Over the next few weeks, I found myself wearing the scarf constantly, even indoors. It wasn't just warm, it was grounding, like carrying a piece of my grandmother with me wherever I went. People started commenting on it, too. Strangers in coffee shops or on the subway would say things like, "That's such a beautiful color," or "That scarf looks cozy." Every time, I'd smile and nod, but what I really wanted to say was, "You don't understand. This isn't just a scarf. It's her. One morning, as I was wrapping it around my neck before heading out, something caught my eye. Tucked into the fringe was a small, hand-stitched tag. It was worn and fraying, the ink barely visible, but I could just make out the words written in tiny, careful letters. For Evelyn. My breath caught. That wasn't my name, but it was my grandmother's middle name. The world seemed to tilt for a moment, like I'd stumbled into some cosmic joke too strange to explain. Could it really be her scarf? Or was it just a coincidence? A trick of fate weaving threads tighter than I could understand? I don't have an answer. I don't think I want one. All I know is that scarf still hangs by my door, a piece of the past wrapped around my present, waiting for me to carry it forward. And maybe that's what nostalgia is, a thread, fragile and impossibly long, tying us to everything we thought we'd lost. What about you? Have you ever found something ordinary that turned out to be extraordinary? Something that felt like it was waiting for you to find it? Let's start a new story. It was a Tuesday, and nothing about the day seemed particularly remarkable until I found myself chasing a wheel of cheese down a hill. To be clear, this wasn't some picturesque European festival where they roll cheese for sport. This was just me in my neighborhood sprinting after a rogue Gouda because apparently my life is a sitcom. Let me back up. The whole fiasco started at the corner store. I'd stop in to grab a few things, milk, bread, and cheese, because I decided to try my hand at making the kind of gourmet grilled cheese sandwich you see on TikTok. The Gouda was fancy, wrapped in wax paper, and priced like it had personally graduated from culinary school. I carried it in my arms like a baby, fully invested in its potential. On the walk home, everything was fine. Birds chirped, a light breeze ruffled the trees, and I was mentally preparing for my culinary debut. Then, as I turned onto my street, I tripped. Not a graceful stumble, mind you, but a full-on, arms flailing, cartoon character wipeout. The bag flew out of my hands, and with horrifying slow-motion clarity, I watched the wheel of cheese roll out, hit the pavement, and start picking up speed. Now, my street isn't particularly steep, but apparently, it's steep enough. The cheese bolted like it had a personal vendetta against me, bouncing off curbs and dodging obstacles with the agility of a squirrel. For a second, I just stood there, processing the absurdity. But then, like some primal instinct kicked in, I yelled, "No, no, no," and took off after it. What followed can only be described as a comedy of errors. I was running full tilt, arms outstretched like a goalie, while the cheese expertly evaded me. It rolled through someone's garden, narrowly missed a mailbox, and then, because the universe loves irony, shot directly toward the park at the end of the street. By the time I made it to the park, I was wheezing and clutching my sides. The cheese, unbothered by my cardiovascular limits, had found its way onto the basketball court. A group of teenagers was playing a pickup game, and for a brief moment, I thought I could just grab the cheese and disappear unnoticed. But, of course, one of the kids spotted it, pointed and yelled, "Yo, is that cheese?" Before I could intervene, they surrounded it like it was a UFO. "It's cheese," one of them confirmed, crouching to inspect it. Another kid picked it up, cradling it like it was a trophy. "Who just leaves cheese like this?" he asked, genuinely perplexed. I stumbled up to the group, red-faced and breathless. "That's my cheese." I managed to gasp, hands on my knees. The kid holding it raised an eyebrow. "Your cheese?" "Yes," I said, standing up and trying to look like a responsible adult who regularly buys expensive dairy products. "It fell out of my bag." Long story. The group exchanged glances, clearly skeptical. One of them, a lanky kid with a mischievous grin, said, "You chasing a wheel of cheese might be the funniest thing I've ever seen. You should have recorded it, bro." I sighed. "Trust me, it wasn't on purpose." Another kid handed me the cheese, which, despite its journey, was miraculously intact. "You're lucky it didn't hit the road," he said. "Cheese homicide." That made me laugh, which seemed to win them over. They asked me what kind of cheese it was, and when I said Gouda, they nodded like I'd passed some unspoken test. I thanked them, stuffed the cheese into my bag, and started to leave. But as I walked away, I heard one of them yell, "Good luck with your cheese quest, Gouda lady." By the time I got home, I was exhausted, sweaty, and strangely exhilarated. The grilled cheese I made that night was frankly underwhelming. But every time I think about that runaway wheel of Gouda, I can't help but smile. It's funny how life throws you these ridiculous little moments that remind you not to take everything so seriously. I mean, who gets to say they went on a literal cheese chase? And more importantly, who's going to believe them? So, what about you? Have you ever had a moment so absurd and unexpected it felt like the universe was playing a joke on you? I'd love to hear it. Because if there's one thing we all need, it's a good story about life's runaway cheese wheels. Let's start a new story. It was the end of April, and with the semester winding down, the tension in the air felt almost combustible. It wasn't just the usual senior year stress, it was the principal's prize. Every spring, Principal Harrison would issue a challenge, a vaguely mysterious task, open to the entire student body, with a prize for whoever pulled it off first. The reward? 2 days off, no questions asked, and your name immortalized on the shiny brass plaque outside his office. It wasn't much, but in the dull grind of high school, it was the stuff of legend. This year's challenge was a single piece of paper pinned to the bulletin board in the cafeteria. It read, "Retrieve the mascot's heart." Most people rolled their eyes. The mascot, a grinning bear named Bramble, had been part of the school since the 1950s. Its suit was creepy enough to fuel decades of urban legends, but it didn't have a heart. It was probably just another of Harrison's metaphors, some clever nonsense to make us think about school spirit or something equally pointless. But something about it gnawed at me. What if it wasn't a metaphor? What if it was real? It started as a half-joke during lunch. "What if Bramble does have a heart?" I said, picking at a soggy tater tot. My friends laughed, but Tyler, the quiet genius who rarely spoke unless it involved obscure trivia or chess, tilted his head. "The original mascot's suit's in the storage room by the old theater," he said, like he'd been waiting for someone to ask. "It's not the one they use now. There's a story about it." The table leaned in. Stories about Bramble always meant one thing: creepy, implausible, irresistible rumors. Tyler obliged, his voice low and deliberate. Back in the 70s, the guy who played Bramble was obsessed with making it authentic. He added all this weird custom stuff to the suit, extra padding, animatronic eyes. He even made a fake heart for it. He said it was supposed to make Bramble more real. But then he disappeared one night, and they locked the suit away. No one talks about it anymore. The table erupted in a nervous laughter, but I wasn't laughing. I knew Principal Harrison loved old school lore. If this heart existed, he'd absolutely use it for the challenge. That night, I roped in Tyler and Brooke, my best friend and the only person with enough charm to talk us out of trouble if we got caught. We agreed to meet after dark, armed with flashlights and a lock-picking kit Tyler swore he bought for educational purposes. The plan was simple: get into the storage room, find the suit, and confirm if this heart was real. We met by the old theater, the air thick with the kind of adrenaline that makes you forget how stupid your plan is. Tyler worked on the lock while Brooke and I kept watch. After a tense minute of metallic clicking, the door creaked open, revealing a dark, dusty corridor that smelled like mothballs and mildew. The storage room was worse. Shelves groaned under decades of forgotten props and costumes, everything cloaked in a fine layer of grime. In the corner, slumped over a broken mannequin, was the original Bramble suit. Its grin looked less friendly in the flickering light of our flashlights, more predatory, like it knew we were there. "Okay, that's creepy as hell," Brooke whispered, but I was already moving toward it. The suit was heavier than it looked, the fabric stiff and brittle. Tyler pointed out the odd stitching along the chest, where a zipper had been sewn shut. His hands trembled as he used a penknife to pry it open, revealing a cavity inside. And there it was. The heart was about the size of a softball, encased in what looked like aged leather. It was stitched together with black thread, and faintly, as if powered by some hidden mechanism, it pulsed. A faint, rhythmic vibration. It shouldn't have been possible, but there it was. "This isn't right," Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How is it moving?" "It's probably battery-powered," I said, though my voice wavered. Batteries didn't last 50 years. Brooke reached out to touch it, but the moment her fingers brushed the surface, the room went dark. Not just dark, total, suffocating blackness. Our flashlights died simultaneously, plunging us into silence broken only by a faint, mechanical whirring. Then we heard it, a dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the floor. "Someone's here," Brooke hissed, her voice trembling. "No," Tyler said, his voice cracking. "Something's here." We scrambled toward the door, but it slammed shut before we reached it. The dragging grew louder, and out of the corner of my eye, I swore I saw Bramble's head turn. "Leave it," Tyler shouted. "Put it back." But I couldn't. Something in me, curiosity, defiance, sheer stupidity, made me clutch the heart tighter. "We're taking it," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "We came for this, and we're not leaving without it." The whirring stopped. The dragging stopped. For one awful second, there was silence. Then the door creaked open. We didn't wait to question it. We ran. Tyler nearly tripped over a stack of paint cans, and Brooke grabbed his arm to steady him as we bolted down the corridor and into the night. By the time we made it to the safety of my car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. We didn't talk much on the way home. The heart sat in my lap, still faintly pulsing, like it had a mind of its own. The next morning, I walked into Principal Harrison's office and placed the heart on his desk. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition, maybe even approval. "You win," he said simply, sliding a certificate for the prize across the desk. "But tell me, how did you find it?" I hesitated. "Does it matter?" He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No," he said. "I suppose it doesn't." I left without another word, but as I walked down the hall, I could have sworn I heard. Let's start a new story. There's a barber shop on the corner of 3rd and Oak, and for years, I walked past it without ever stepping inside. Not because I had anything against barbershops, but because I didn't need one. I've been bald since my late 20s, which is a story in itself, involving a stress-fueled year and a box of hair dye that went horribly wrong. But this isn't about that. This is about the day I finally walked into that barbershop and how it changed everything. It started with the sign. They just put it up, one of those old-school sandwich boards with bold, chalky letters that read, "Free Shave Fridays. Tips for stories welcome." This stories part got me. I'm a sucker for that kind of thing. The promise of human connection, or at least a good anecdote. So, even though I didn't really need a shave, I figured, why not? The place was small, cozy in a way that felt intentional, like it had been designed for people who had time to linger. A vintage barber chair sat in the center of the room, its leather cracked but polished. The walls were lined with photographs, black and white shots of men with slicked back hair, women with pinned curls, kids grinning with their first haircuts. There was a faint smell of shaving cream and something herbal I couldn't quite place, like lavender mixed with cedar. The barber was an older man with sharp eyes and a beard that could have made Santa Claus jealous. He introduced himself as Gus and gestured for me to sit. I hesitated, rubbing my smooth scalp. "I don't really have much for you to work with," I said, and he laughed, a deep, gravelly sound that seemed to fill the whole shop. "A shave's not about the hair," he said. "It's about the ritual. See? Tell me a story." So I sat. Gus draped a warm towel over my face, and for a moment, the world shrank to the scent of steam and the hum of his movements. When he peeled it away, he had a straight razor in hand, its blade glinting under the shop's yellow light. "Well," he said, tilting my head gently to the side. "Story time." I scrambled for something to say, feeling weirdly vulnerable. "Okay." There was this time in college. I began, launching into a half-baked tale about a road trip that ended with my friend's car breaking down in the desert. It wasn't my best work, but Gus listened intently, nodding and chuckling in all the right places. By the time I finished, my cheeks were smooth and my skin tingled from whatever aftershave he'd used. He patted my shoulder and said, "Good story. Next time, bring me a better one." I laughed, thinking I'd probably never come back. But a week later, I found myself standing in front of that sandwich board again. This time, I told him about the summer I worked at a theme park, wrangling unruly kids in 100-degree heat. The week after that, I told him about my grandmother, who once locked herself out of her house with a pie cooling on the windowsill and ended up bribing a raccoon with it to get her spare key. Each Friday became a ritual. I'd walk into the shop, and Gus would greet me, with that same gravelly laugh, his razor glinting like an invitation. I'd tell him a story, sometimes funny, sometimes bittersweet, and in return, he'd tell me one of his own. His were always better. He talked about growing up in Brooklyn, about the time he gave himself a black eye trying to impress a girl with a backflip. He told me about his first job sweeping hair off the floor in a barbershop just like this one, and the time a customer left a $100 tip folded into the pages of a worn-out paperback. Best book I ever read, he said, though he couldn't remember the title. One Friday, I came in and found the chair empty. The smell of lavender and cedar lingered, but Gus wasn't there. A younger man, clean-shaven and nervous-looking, stood behind the counter. "Are you here for a shave?" he asked, his voice a poor substitute for Gus's warm growl. "Where's Gus?" I asked. The man hesitated. He retired last week, moved down to Florida to be near his grandkids. It hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't realized how much I'd come to look forward to those Fridays, how much I'd needed them. Without Gus, the shop felt hollow, like a stage set with the main actor missing. I sat in the chair anyway, and the young barber did his best, but it wasn't the same. When he asked me for a story, I froze. Without Gus's expectant eyes and knowing smile, the words wouldn't come. I left the shop that day feeling off-kilter, like I'd lost something I didn't even know I had. For a while, I avoided Third and Oak altogether. But one day, a few months later, I found myself there again, staring at the sign. Free Shave Fridays. Tips for stories welcome. The chalk was Messier now, but the words were the same. Inside, the younger barber was still there, fumbling with the tools in that vintage chair. I almost walked away, but then I thought about Gus, about the stories we'd shared and the ones I still hadn't told. So I went in, sat down, and started talking. That's when I realized Gus was right. A shave wasn't about the hair. It was about the ritual, about sitting still, letting someone take care of you, and sharing something real, no matter how small. And if Gus could start that tradition, maybe I could keep it going. So, here's my question. What's a small, unexpected ritual in your life that's meant more to you than you thought it would? Maybe it's not a barbershop, but I bet there's something. Tell me your story. I'm all ears. Let's start a new story. The elevator in my apartment building stopped at a floor that didn't exist. I was coming home late, weighed down by a bag of groceries and the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones after a day that overstays its welcome. The elevator buttons were worn and sticky, and as I jabbed the one for my floor, the fifth, a familiar groan vibrated through the walls. The fluorescent light inside the car flickered like it was unsure whether to keep trying. But instead of stopping at 5, the elevator slid past my floor with a sluggish hum. Seriously? I muttered, jamming the button again, harder this time. It didn't stop. The car rose past 6, then 7, and by the time the screen above the door displayed an 8 I was certain didn't exist, I felt my stomach knot. The elevator stopped with a metallic sigh, and the doors slid open. Beyond them was a hallway I'd never seen before. The walls were deep red, their paint cracked and peeling in jagged streaks. The carpet was a dull, mustard yellow, worn so thin I could see the concrete beneath in patches. Faint music played from somewhere I couldn't see, soft, jazzy piano notes, the kind of thing you'd expect to hear in an old speakeasy, not the 8th floor of a rundown building. I stepped out without thinking, the groceries forgotten in the elevator behind me. The air smelled different here, damp and earthy, like the scent of rain on concrete. The hallway stretched farther than it should have, the dim light from a single flickering bulb above the elevator casting long shadows across the floor. A door stood at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. I should have gone back to the elevator, hit the buttons until it carried me back to the safety of my apartment. But there was something about the door, something that pulled at me, the way a loose thread demands to be tugged. The closer I got, the louder the music grew. It wasn't just a piano now. There were voices, too. Laughter and murmurs, the faint clink of glasses. A party. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The air was warm here, charged with a strange kind of energy, like the space itself was alive. I pushed the door open. Inside was a room that shouldn't have fit into the building. It was enormous, stretching out in every direction, filled with a soft golden light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Dozens of people milled about, dressed in clothes from another time. Pinstripe suits, flapper dresses that shimmered with every movement, feathered hats perched at Johnny angles. They didn't notice me at first, their faces glowing with an odd, timeless kind of joy. "Welcome," a voice said behind me. I spun around to see a man leaning casually against the doorframe. He was tall, with sharp cheekbones and a cigarette balanced between his fingers. His suit was immaculate, deep gray with a pocket square that looked like it cost more than my monthly rent. "Hi," I said, taking a step back. "You're late," he said, as if that explained everything. "Late for what?" His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "The party, of course. I think there's been a mistake. I was just trying to get to my apartment." "Everyone says that at first," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Come on, have a drink. You'll feel better once you've settled in." Before I could argue, he stepped past me, heading toward a bar that had appeared at the far end of the room. I turned back to the door, but it was gone. Panic bubbled up in my chest, but before I could do anything reckless, like scream or punch a hole in a wall, a woman in a red dress appeared at my side. She had dark hair pinned into soft waves, a cigarette holder dangling elegantly from one hand. "You look lost," she said, her voice smooth as honey. "I am," I said, unable to keep the edge out of my tone. "Where am I?" "The last stop," she said with a smile that felt more like a warning. "Last stop for what?" "For whatever it is you're running from." Her words settled over me like a net, heavy and unshakable. I opened my mouth to argue, but the room shifted around us, and suddenly she was gone. The music swelled, the voices rising and falling like the tide. I wandered through the crowd, searching for answers that refused to come. Every face I passed was unfamiliar, but their eyes followed me like they knew something I didn't. At the edge of the room, I found a small table with a mirror propped against the wall behind it. I leaned closer, staring at my reflection, and my breath caught in my throat. The person staring back at me wasn't quite me. It looked like me at first, same face, same hair, same tired eyes. But there was something off, something in the way my reflection's lips curled into a smirk when I wasn't smiling. "Don't worry," a voice whispered in my ear. I spun around, but no one was there. The mirror fogged, the glass warping until the reflection dissolved into a different scene. I saw myself back in my apartment, sitting at the kitchen table, my face pale and drawn. The scene shifted again. Now I was on a train, staring out the window as a city I didn't recognize blurred past. Then a third image, me, sitting on a beach under a sky so dark it seemed to swallow the stars. The mirror went blank, leaving only my reflection once more. "Found what you were looking for?" the man in the suit asked, appearing at my side. "I don't know what I'm looking for," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Good," he said, his smile sharp as a blade. "That's the point." The room dimmed, the golden light fading into a cool, silvery glow. The music softened, the voices growing distant, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. When I blinked, I was back in the elevator. The button for the 5th floor was glowing softly, and the screen above the door showed I was right where I was supposed to be. The doors opened, revealing the familiar hallway of my building. I stepped out, my legs unsteady, and glanced down at my hands. They were empty now, no groceries, no evidence that any of it had happened. But the faint smell of cigarettes lingered in the air, and when I reached into my pocket, I found a feather. It shimmered gold in the fluorescent light, impossibly soft. I never saw the 8th floor again, no matter how many times I rode the elevator late at night. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear faint music drifting through the walls, and I wonder if it's calling me back. Let's start a new story. Yesterday, I found myself walking through the downtown square during my lunch break, the kind of lazy, meandering stroll where the aim isn't to get somewhere, but just to be somewhere. The square was alive with its usual chaos. Street musicians competing for attention, a kid trying to convince their mom they really needed ice cream before lunch, and a guy in a suit power walking like his life depended on it. But then, something small and quiet caught my eye. There was a woman sitting on the edge of a fountain, maybe in her late 20s, with a worn paperback in her lap and a dog-eared notebook beside her. A group of teenage boys nearby were trying to impress each other by doing some decidedly unimpressive skateboard tricks. One of them botched a move, sending the board flying straight toward her. I winced, waiting for the inevitable collision, but she caught it midair with one hand, her eyes still glued to the page. She didn't even flinch. The boys ran over, full of awkward apologies, but she just smiled, handed the board back, and said, "You're overthinking it. Let your shoulders relax." She didn't even look up from her book. The boys exchanged confused glances, and one of them, the ringleader type, scoffed like, "Yeah, okay, lady." But then, like they couldn't help themselves, they started trying her advice. One by one, they gave it a go, their movements loosening as they stopped trying so hard to nail it. And when one of them finally landed the trick, they hooped so loudly that even the pigeons scattered. The woman just smiled to herself, like a magician who'd just done a simple card trick but wasn't about to explain it. Then she closed her book, picked up her notebook, and walked away, leaving the boys to their celebrations. I stood there for a moment, grinning like an idiot, and thought about how often moments like that slip by unnoticed. How someone shares a piece of wisdom, something simple, almost throwaway, and it changes the trajectory of a person's day, maybe even their week. It's funny how much we influence each other without even realizing it. Like this other time, not too long ago, when I was in line at the grocery store, there was a man ahead of me buying exactly 3 items: a frozen pizza, a carton of almond milk, and a pack of chocolate chip cookies. The cashier, a college-age kid with shaggy hair and a name tag that said Kyle, rang him up and said, "Solid choices, dude. You're living the dream." The man laughed and said, "More like surviving it." But then, as he grabbed his bag, he paused and said, almost to himself, "Actually, you know what? Maybe I am living the dream. Pizza, cookies, milk could be worse." Kyle nodded sagely, like he was some kind of 19-year-old philosopher, and said, "It's all about perspective, man." It was such a tiny interaction, barely worth mentioning, but it stuck with me. I mean, how many times have I rushed through my day without stopping to realize that even the most ordinary moments, the frozen pizza kind of moments, can be a version of the dream? That perspective shifted me again last week when I got on the subway after a long, awful day. You know those days where everything feels just a little harder than it should? The kind of day where even the sound of someone chewing gum too loudly makes you want to scream? That kind of day. I slumped into a seat, trying to melt into the anonymity of the crowd, when I noticed a guy sitting across from me. He was holding one of those old-school cassette players, complete with a pair of foam headphones that looked older than I am. He was bopping his head along to the music, completely oblivious to the world around him. I couldn't help myself. I asked, "What are you listening to?" He pulled off the headphones and grinned like I'd just handed him the winning lottery ticket. "The first mixtape I ever made," he said. "I found it in a box today. Does it still hold up?" I asked, smiling despite myself. "Oh, it's terrible," he said. "But that's kind of the point. It's like a time capsule of who I was back then, awkward, dramatic, thought I knew everything. But man, the kid who made this tape was all in. Every song was picked like it was life or death." I laughed, and for the rest of the ride, we swapped stories about the things we'd rediscovered. Old journals, embarrassing photos, forgotten hobbies. By the time I got off the train, my bad day had completely evaporated. That guy's joy, his willingness to share this little piece of his past with a stranger, was contagious. It's moments like these that make me wonder how much of our happiness is tied to the people we bump into, the skater boys, the grocery store philosophers, the guy with the mixtape. These fleeting connections remind me that the world is full of surprises, and not all of them are big or loud. Some are quiet, almost imperceptible, like the rustle of a page turning or the sound of wheels hitting pavement just right. So, now I'm curious. What's a small moment or encounter that's made you pause and think, wow, the world's actually kind of beautiful sometimes? Something you... Let's start a new story. I always knew there was something wrong with my neighbor, Mr. Callahan. You don't spend 30 years as a high school biology teacher without developing a sixth sense for liars. And that man's smile was all tells and no substance. It wasn't the kind of wrong that got you a feature on the nightly news. Not the big, obvious stuff. No, Callahan was the quiet kind of wrong, the type that festered in the cracks of polite society. He moved in a year ago, claiming he was retired military. That was the first red flag. His gait was too sloppy, his frame too soft for someone who'd spent decades in the service. Then there was the house itself. A mid-century ranch like mine, but meticulously maintained. Too perfect, even. The yard was manicured with the precision of a man who spent his mornings measuring grass blades, and the windows were always spotless. If you knocked on the door, he'd answer within seconds, as if he were standing by, waiting for an excuse. But it wasn't until the night I lost my cat that I started putting the pieces together. Pumpkin was an indoor cat, fat and spoiled and deeply uninterested in the outdoors. So, when I came home to find the front door ajar and no sign of her, I knew something was wrong. I searched the house first, calling her name in that sing-song way that made her come waddling. Nothing. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, peering into bushes and under cars, my panic mounting. It was Callahan who found her. He appeared out of the dark like some twisted apparition, holding Pumpkin in his arms. She was limp, her fur matted with something dark and sticky. I saw her wandering the street, he said, his voice too smooth, too rehearsed. Guess she got into a fight. You should keep her inside. I snatched her from him without saying a word and rushed her to the vet. Pumpkin survived, but barely. The vet said she'd been injured by something sharp, like a blade, not another animal. I asked Callahan about it the next day, but his story didn't change. He even chuckled, as if I were overreacting. After that, I started watching him. Not in the casual, suburban way where you notice who doesn't mow their lawn, but in the obsessive, notebook-in-hand way that makes your friends start avoiding eye contact. Callahan had a routine, and it was boring as hell. Morning jog, grocery runs every Tuesday, an occasional trip to the hardware store. But at night, things got strange. Every night at exactly 10:15, he'd leave his house and walk to his shed. It was one of those prefab deals, the kind you see in hardware store catalogs, painted a bland tan to match his house. He'd stay in there for hours, long after the neighborhood had gone to sleep, and when he finally emerged, he always carried a large black duffel bag. What's worse, the smell started around the same time. It was faint at first, a sickly sweet odor that wafted through the air like burnt sugar. It got stronger with each passing night, seeping into the edges of my home. I told myself it was probably some weird fertilizer or a dead animal he hadn't disposed of properly. But deep down, I knew better. One night, when the smell was unbearable, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on a pair of gloves, and waited until Callahan left for one of his late-night jogs. His shed was locked, of course, but the padlock was cheap, the kind you could pop with a firm twist of a crowbar. The door creaked open, revealing a workspace that looked more like a crime scene than a tool shed. There were jars everywhere, filled with murky liquid and things floating inside, organs maybe? I couldn't tell. A surgical table sat in the middle of the room, its stainless steel surface stained with rust and something darker. Then there was the freezer. It was one of those chest freezers, the kind you see in basements and garages. My hands were shaking as I opened it, half expecting to find something out of a horror movie. Instead, there were bags, black duffel bags, identical to the ones I'd seen him carrying. I unzipped one. Inside were papers, reams of documents, handwritten notes, and Polaroid photos of people I didn't recognize. But what caught my eye was the map. A detailed street map of our town, with houses circled in red ink. Mine was circled 3 times. I shoved everything back into the bag, closed the freezer, and bolted. By the time I made it back to my house, I was hyperventilating. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The next morning, Callahan was gone. His house was empty, his yard already starting to wilt without his meticulous care. The only sign he'd ever been there was a single black duffel bag left on my porch. Inside was a note. You're next. I don't live in that house anymore. In fact, I don't live anywhere for long. I keep moving, keep watching, because no matter how far I go, I can still smell the sickly sweet odor of burnt sugar. Let's start a new story. I was halfway down Sycamore Street, walking to nowhere in particular, when it landed on a lamppost just ahead of me. A starling, black feathers glinting with iridescent greens and purples under the pale morning light. It tilted its head, watching something I couldn't see, then erupted into song, an impossibly intricate stream of whistles and clicks that rose above the usual urban symphony of car engines and distant sirens. For a second, I stopped, held there by the sheer audacity of it. This tiny creature, barely a handful of feathers, singing its heart out in the middle of a city that wasn't even paying attention. When it finally flew away, I kept walking, but the bird stayed with me, its song tucked somewhere in the back of my mind like a secret I didn't fully understand. The world around me seemed a little sharper after that, as if the act of noticing the bird had tuned my vision to some hidden frequency. At the corner of Sycamore and Ninth, a man in a white apron was hosing down the sidewalk in front of his bakery. The water sprayed in a wide arc, scattering crumbs and cigarette butts into the gutter. As I passed, the smell of yeast and sugar hit me, warm and rich, like the memory of Sunday mornings at my grandmother's house. A line had already formed at the door, people shifting from foot to foot, glancing at their watches, each of them tethered to the promise of croissants and coffee. Further down the street, a woman stood on the steps of a brownstone, struggling to wrangle an oversized package through the front door. The box was enormous, nearly as big as she was, and her attempts to maneuver it felt like watching someone wrestle a bear. A man passing by stopped without a word, set down his briefcase, and helped her lift it inside. She didn't thank him right away. Instead, they both stood there for a moment, catching their breath, their faces flushed from the effort. Finally, she smiled and said something I couldn't hear, and he nodded before continuing on his way, his briefcase swinging at his side. I turned onto 12th Street, where the morning market was setting up. Vendors were unloading crates of vegetables, their voices mingling in a low, pleasant hum as they haggled over space and prices. A woman in a yellow headscarf was arranging bunches of lavender on a wooden table, her hands moving with practiced precision. The lavender glowed faintly in the gray light, a soft, dusty purple that looked more like a memory than a color. Nearby, a little boy stood clutching a handful of coins, staring at a basket of strawberries, as though he were weighing the most important decision of his life. His father crouched beside him, pointing to the basket and whispering something encouraging. The boy hesitated, then nodded solemnly and handed over his coins. The vendor smiled and handed him the basket, and the boy's face lit up like he'd just been given a treasure chest. At the edge of the market, a busker was playing an accordion, his fingers flying over the keys with an energy that seemed at odds with the mournful tune he was playing. A small crowd had gathered around him, their faces quiet and serious, as if the music had pulled something deep from inside them. An older woman stepped forward and dropped a folded bill into his open case, her hands trembling slightly as she did. He nodded at her, his playing never faltering, and for a moment, the two of them seemed connected by something neither of them could name. I left the market and wandered into the park. The rain from the night before had left the grass damp and shining, and the air smelled faintly of earth and pine. A man was running laps around the fountain, his breath visible in the chilly air. Each time he passed me, I noticed something different: his mismatched socks, the rhythm of his steps, the way he muttered under his breath, as if encouraging himself to keep going. Nearby, two women were sitting on a bench, deep in conversation. One of them had a sketchbook open on her lap, and she was gesturing wildly with her pencil as she spoke. The other woman listened intently, her head tilted to one side, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. Their voices were low, but their energy was palpable, as though the words they shared were urgent and alive. I sat down on a bench across from the fountain and watched as the city moved around me. A couple walked past, their hands brushing against each other but never quite touching. A cyclist wove expertly through a group of tourists, his movements so fluid it was like watching water find its way downhill. A squirrel darted across the path, a piece of bread clutched in its mouth, and disappeared into the bushes. It struck me, then, how much of the world goes unnoticed, not because it's hidden, but because it's so constant that we forget to see it. The way a stranger's laugh can linger in the air long after they've gone. The way a raindrop clings to the edge of a leaf, defying gravity for just a moment longer than it should. The way people move together without ever acknowledging the choreography. Each of us a thread in this vast, unspoken tapestry. By the time I left the park, the bird's song had faded from my mind, replaced by the sound of the accordion, the boys' laughter, the soft murmur of leaves in the wind. But the feeling it had sparked, the sense that the ordinary is brimming with something extraordinary, remained. So I have to ask, what have you noticed lately that makes you feel like the world is a little more alive than you thought? Let's start a new story. The realization hit me somewhere between the self-checkout machine beeping angrily and me trying to juggle an armful of bananas. The machine had decided, in its infinite wisdom, that I was attempting to steal produce. Unexpected item in the bagging area. It droned, while a cashier half my age shuffled over with the air of someone who'd seen this same battle play out 5 times that hour. I watched her reset the machine with a practiced flick of her wrist, and in that moment I thought, this is it. This is my life now, arguing with a robot over bananas. Later, I sat in my car, bananas safely stowed in the back seat, and laughed so hard I had to wipe my eyes. What struck me wasn't the absurdity of the situation itself. It's 2024. We've all been there, but the fact that I wasn't even surprised. Somewhere along the way, these tiny skirmishes with technology had become normal, like spilling coffee or losing a sock in the dryer. Little battles that no one prepared us for, but we've all just learned to deal with. Take my morning routine, for instance. It's become this elaborate dance of apps, alarms, and notifications, each demanding my attention like a pack of overly eager interns. My phone wakes me up with a weather update. Good morning. It's 43 degrees with a chance of rain. Maybe grab an umbrella. My smartwatch chimes in immediately. Don't forget your morning stretch. By the time I've reached my coffee maker, which naturally has pre-brewed my favorite blend and is cheerfully blinking ready, I feel like I've already attended a board meeting with my own appliances. And yet, for all their helpfulness, they're not exactly perfect. My smart speaker has developed an unsettling habit of chiming in during conversations. The other night, I was telling a friend about an old sci-fi book I loved, and mid-sentence, it interrupted. Here's a list of popular sci-fi novels. Thanks, I guess? It's like having an overly enthusiastic, slightly tone-deaf roommate who doesn't understand social cues but really wants to help. I've started whispering certain words just to avoid triggering it, which has made me feel like I'm living in some kind of dystopian spy drama. My dog, by the way, thinks I've lost my mind. Then there's the constant stream of targeted ads that seem to know me better than I know myself. A couple of weeks ago, I clicked on a recipe for homemade bread, just once, mind you, and now every single ad I see is for artisanal bread-making kits, sourdough starter, or tiny, ridiculously expensive butter knives. I don't even bake. I mean, yes, I did think about baking, but since when did my fleeting thoughts have such direct consequences? I can't decide if the algorithm is eerily brilliant or just mildly deranged. Probably both. But the pinnacle of this modern absurdity has to be delivery culture. Last month, I ordered one single avocado from a grocery app. Not because I desperately needed an avocado, but because I was too lazy to go out, and it was the only thing standing between me and guacamole. The driver showed up 20 minutes later with a plastic bag containing my lone avocado, wrapped protectively in enough tissue paper to cushion a Fabergé egg. The look on their face when they handed it over will haunt me forever. A mix of confusion, resignation, and feigned amusement, like they were silently wondering how civilization had reached this point. Honestly, same. Still, it's not all ridiculous. Sometimes, the quirks of modern life are so quietly magical, they take your breath away. A few weeks ago, I was out on a walk, headphones in, listening to a playlist curated by some algorithm that seemed to understand my mood better than I did. It was early evening, and the sky was doing that thing where it looks like it's been painted in watercolor, soft streaks of pink and orange melting into each other. And as I turned a corner, the perfect song started playing. Not just a good song, but the kind that makes you stop in your tracks and wonder if the universe is playing a little joke just for you. In that moment, I felt oddly connected to everything. My neighborhood, the strangers I'd never meet, even the mysterious algorithm that had somehow orchestrated this small, perfect moment. It's strange, isn't it? How we've adapted to this chaos, this constant tug of war between the incredible and the absurd. We've become fluent in a language we didn't even realize we were learning. A language of memes, emojis, and inside jokes that span entire continents. Last night, a friend sent me a video of a cat knocking over a tower of blocks, and somehow, without a single word exchanged, I knew exactly what they were trying to say. I feel like this today. Everything's too much. Send help. So I sent back a gif of a dog in sunglasses, wagging its tail like it had life all figured out. No words, no explanations. Just a little reassurance wrapped in pixels. And you know what? It worked. Maybe that's the heart of it. The way we've learned to find meaning in the madness, joy in the smallest, strangest corners. Like the tiny ritual of opening a package. Even when you know it's just paper towels or toothpaste, and still feeling a spark of excitement. Or the quiet satisfaction of sharing a ridiculous tweet and knowing, in that moment, that someone on the other side of the screen is laughing just as hard as you are. So yeah, sometimes I feel like I'm living in a surrealist painting, surrounded by smart gadgets, snack flavors that shouldn't exist, and delivery drivers who think I'm insane. But other times I think, maybe this is what progress looks like. Messy, unpredictable, and deeply, beautifully human. What about you? What's one thing about life today that makes you stop and think, oh, this is kind of amazing? Let's start a new story. I woke up to the distinct sound of my closet clearing its throat. It wasn't a normal sound, mind you, not raspy or wet. It was polite, like an English butler preparing to deliver bad news. Ahem, it said, the oak panels vibrating slightly. Good morning, sir. A word, if I may. Now, I'm not a morning person. I'm not even a mid-morning person. So, my brain took a few moments to process this. First, that I was definitely awake. Second, that my closet was in fact speaking. And third, that it had a surprisingly refined British accent. What? I croaked, unsure if this was the appropriate way to respond to a piece of furniture. It's about your shirts, the closet said, a faint edge of disapproval in its voice. They're in absolute disarray. The flannels are fraternizing with the polos, and the formal wear has been shoved unceremoniously to the back. It's chaos in here, sir. Chaos. I stared at the closet, then down at myself. I was wearing the same sweatpants and hoodie I'd worn for 3 days straight. If my closet was looking for someone who respected sartorial order, it had clearly come to the wrong person. I'll deal with it later. I offered, hoping to placate it. The closet sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that made me feel like I'd disappointed not just it, but an entire lineage of closets that had come before it. Very well, it said, but don't be surprised if your trousers stage a rebellion. From there, the day only got weirder. My bathroom mirror greeted me with a cheerful, "Good morning, beautiful," before pausing. Oh no, you're looking rustic today. May I suggest a splash of cold water and perhaps some effort? I grimaced at my reflection. Thanks for the boost in self-esteem. The mirror sked. Just trying to help? You can't improve what you don't acknowledge, darling. As I brushed my teeth, the toothbrush piped up, its voice tinny and high-pitched, like an over-enthusiastic mascot. Left side, get the molars. Don't skimp on the tongue, buddy. This is a team effort. The toothpaste tube joined in, mumbling through a mouthful of itself. He never squeezes me right. Always from the middle. Savage. By the time I made it to the kitchen, I was bracing myself for whatever awaited me there. Sure enough, the fridge had opinions. You're out of eggs, it informed me flatly. And that yogurt? It's been in here so long, it's learned to read. The coffee maker was a different beast entirely. Oh, look who decided to crawl out of bed, it said, dripping sarcasm along with hot water. You want caffeine? How about a little gratitude first? I work harder than anything else in this house. And do I get a thank you? No, just endless demands for lattes. As it grumbled, I noticed a suspiciously quiet loaf of bread sitting on the counter. I reached for it, and it hissed, "Don't touch me with those unwashed hands." I jerked back, startled. What? The bread snapped. You think I want your morning breath all over my crust? Disgusting. At this point, I was seriously considering whether I'd hit my head or maybe wandered into some kind of alternate reality. But as the day went on, I started to realize that this wasn't entirely bad. For one, the toaster was incredibly supportive. "Look at you making breakfast. You're crushing it today, champ. Want me to crisp this bread to perfection? Say the word." The birds outside the window, on the other hand, were less encouraging. They were gathered on a branch, chattering loudly about some squirrel drama. He stole the acorns, but then blamed it on his brother. Classic Jeremy. One of them squawked. Another added, "I always said he was no good." You can see it in the tale. The real turning point, though, was my couch. I sat down, and it groaned, not just from my weight, but like an old man about to give unsolicited advice. "Listen," it said, its cushions shifting slightly beneath me. "You've been spending a lot of time here lately. Too much time, if you ask me. Maybe take a walk? Get some fresh air? I'm not saying you're lazy, but if you were a potato, you'd be mashed." "Excuse me?" I shot back. "You're literally a couch. Sitting is your whole deal." It chuckled. "Fair point. But still, mix it up. Go talk to the lamp or something. It's been itching to share its opinions on your bedtime habits." Sure enough, when I passed the lamp, it flickered dramatically. "Do you know what time you went to bed last night?" "Because I do." It was obscene. "Honestly, you're abusing me. I'm not a night owl, you know." The rest of the day unfolded in similarly strange fashion. My laptop critiqued my typing. "All thumbs today, aren't we?" My phone begged for a break from TikTok, and my car refused to start until I promised to check its oil. Even the grass outside had something to say, rustling together to whisper complaints about being overstepped, literally. But the strangest part? It was kind of nice. Sure, my couch was judgy, and my bread had a superiority complex, but for the first time in ages, I didn't feel alone. The world around me was alive, bursting with opinions and personalities I'd never imagined. It was chaotic, yes, but it was also vibrant and endlessly entertaining. So now I'm wondering, if you woke up tomorrow and everything around you could talk, your furniture, your breakfast, even the trees, would you embrace the madness? Or would you just cover your ears and hope for silence? Let's start a new story. It began in the middle of nowhere, as these things tend to. A pit stop. A literal one. My car had broken down on a stretch of road that seemed to exist only as a suggestion. No gas stations, no nearby towns, just the desert pressing in on either side. The kind of place where the horizon curves just enough to make you feel like you might fall off the edge of the world. I had just stepped out of the car to call for a tow when I heard it. A low, melodic hum, carried by the wind like it was looking for someone. I turned, half expecting to see another car approaching, but there was nothing. The hum deepened, almost like it was singing to me now. It made no sense, but it also made too much sense, if that makes any sense at all. Then I saw the sign. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. It stood tall and clean, despite the dust swirling around me. A wooden plank nailed to a crooked post, with two words painted in looping, white script, Lost Springs. I don't know why I started walking. I think I told myself it was curiosity, but the truth is it felt more like an invitation. And who says no to a sign in the middle of nowhere? The hum grew louder as I moved, and after about half a mile, I found it. The town, or what was left of it. It was a cluster of sagging buildings that looked like they'd been abandoned for decades, wood-warped by sun and wind, windows missing or cracked. Yet it didn't feel empty. The hum was coming from everywhere now, wrapping around the buildings like a melody that had forgotten the words. And at the center of it all was the fountain. It was massive, made of smooth, dark stone that gleamed like it had just been polished. The water gushing from it was impossibly clear, cascading into a wide basin that seemed to glow faintly, as if lit from within. The strangest thing, though, was the fountain's centerpiece, a bronze figure of a woman. She was holding a jar tipped on its side, water pouring from its mouth. Her expression was serene, but there was something about her eyes. They weren't quite looking at anything. It felt like they were waiting. I should have been unnerved, but instead I felt calm. Like I'd stumbled into a dream I wasn't meant to wake from yet. That's when I noticed the first door. It was the door to a shop. A dusty general store with shelves still stocked in a strange, frozen-in-time way. It creaked open on its own as I approached, revealing rows of neatly arranged items. Canned food, old toys, stacks of yellowing newspapers. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, except for one thing. A postcard. It sat alone on the counter, impossibly clean, its colors bright and vivid. I picked it up. The front showed the fountain I'd just seen, but the scene around it was alive. The buildings were new, the sky was vibrant, and people were milling about, smiling, laughing, holding hands. On the back, in looping script that matched the sign, was a single sentence. Take something, leave something, and the town will grow. I turned, suddenly aware of the silence. The hum was gone now, just wind and the occasional creak of wood. I looked at the postcard again, and without really thinking about it, I slipped it into my pocket. Outside, the air felt heavier, like the town was holding its breath. I walked back toward the fountain, and that's when I saw her. She was sitting on the edge of the basin, barefoot, wearing a dress that seemed to shift colors in the sunlight. Her hair was long and loose, curling over her shoulders in a way that reminded me of old paintings. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the water. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice cracking against the quiet. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she dipped her hand into the water and let it drip through her fingers. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost shy. Nobody important. I should have left it there, but something about her made me stay. "What is this place?" She tilted her head, finally meeting my eyes. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me." She smiled, a small, sad smile that made me feel like I'd asked the wrong question. "It's not about what it is. It's about what it could be." Before I could ask what she meant, she stood and started walking toward one of the buildings. I followed because of course I did. She led me to a small house with a faded sign over the door that read "Room to Let." Inside, everything was covered in sheets, like someone had left in a hurry but planned to come back. She stopped in the middle of the room and pointed to a table. On it was a small music box, carved with intricate patterns of stars and moons. "Take it," she said. "Why?" "Because you already did." I wanted to argue, but the words caught in my throat. She was right. Somehow, I had already taken it, though I didn't know how or when. I picked up the music box, and the hum returned, soft and steady, like a heartbeat. "What do I leave?" I asked, but when I turned, she was gone. I stepped outside, clutching the music box, and felt the town shift around me. The buildings didn't change exactly, but they stood a little straighter, looked a little brighter. The fountain's glow was stronger now, and for a moment, I thought I saw people moving in the distance, figures flickering like a half-remembered dream. I walked back to my car, the music box still humming faintly in my hands. When I looked over my shoulder, the sign for Lost Springs was gone. I'll try to go back. Believe me, I've tried, but the road never takes me there again. The music box sits on my shelf now, and sometimes when the house is quiet, it hums. I don't know what it's waiting for. Maybe for me to find someone who needs it more. Have you ever stumbled into a place that didn't belong to this world and left feeling like you'd stolen a piece of it? Let's start a new story. I woke to the sound of a clock softly debating its own existence. It wasn't my clock. My clock has always been a perfectly ordinary machine that ticks dutifully and occasionally beeps if I press the wrong button. But today, the clock on my nightstand sat upright. Yes, sat balanced precariously on the roundness of its base and muttered to itself in a voice like shuffling pages. "I measure time," it said, as though explaining itself to an invisible jury. But what is time? Is it real, or just a series of illusions layered one atop the other like poorly made lasagna? I considered ignoring it. Then again, a clock questioning the nature of reality seemed worth investigating. "You're doing great," I mumbled, still half asleep. "Keep going." The clock gave a startled hop, which I found impressive since it had no legs, and fell silent. When I rolled out of bed, my feet landed on something unexpected. Not the wooden floorboards I knew so well, but moss, soft, springy, and faintly glowing. It wasn't the ordinary green of forest moss, but a shifting spectrum of colors, like an oil slick under a street lamp. Each step I took set off ripples of light that ran ahead of me, illuminating the path as though the moss itself were saying, "This way. This way." The door to my kitchen was ajar, and I swear I heard voices. Low, conspiratorial murmurs, punctuated by the occasional giggle. When I pushed the door open, my appliances froze, caught in what could only be described as an act of mischief. The toaster had jammed a wooden spoon into the microwave's door handle, and the coffee maker was perched precariously on the counter, wearing a colander as a hat. The fridge was the first to speak. Its voice was deep and gravelly, like a nightclub bouncer who's seen too much. "You weren't supposed to see this." The toaster hissed. "Abort the plan." "What plan?" I asked, because at this point, what else was I supposed to do? The coffee maker let out a theatrical sigh. "It's ruined now," it said. "We were going to surprise you with breakfast." But somebody, here it glared at the fridge, couldn't keep their hinges quiet. "Sorry," the fridge muttered, looking genuinely sheepish. Breakfast turned out to be an excellent cup of coffee, a perfectly toasted slice of sourdough, and an orange that peeled itself with the dexterity of a magician. I thanked the appliances profusely. The coffee maker sniffed and said, "It's the least we could do," before hopping down from the counter with surprising grace. Outside, the world had restructured itself into something that felt simultaneously ancient and brand new. The streets weren't straight anymore. They curved and looped, and occasionally disappeared into glowing arches that hummed with a sound you could feel in your teeth. The trees along the sidewalks had grown faces, not realistic ones, but stylized, like something out of a woodcut illustration. They watched me as I passed, their eyes following with an air of mild curiosity. At the end of the street, a group of children were building something extraordinary. Not a sandcastle or a fort, but a sprawling city of translucent cubes that floated just above the ground. The cubes shimmered with an internal light, and each time a child added a new piece, the entire structure shifted, rearranging itself with a sound like tinkling glass. "What is it?" I asked one of the kids, a boy with hair that sparkled as though it had been dipped in stardust. "It's a model of what's coming," he said matter-of-factly. "We're practicing." "For what?" The boy looked at me like I'd asked why birds have wings. "The change, obviously," he said, then turned back to his work. Further down the road, I found a bench that had sprouted tiny legs and was pacing nervously in front of a flower bed. "Are you okay?" I asked, because apparently that was a normal question to ask furniture now. The bench stopped and looked at me, or at least it gave the impression of looking, even though it didn't have eyes. "No," it said. "I've been trying to propose to that hydrangea all morning, but I can't find the words." I glanced at the flower bed, where the hydrangea in question swayed gently, its blue petals shimmering with an almost flirtatious energy. "Maybe just start with hello?" I suggested. The bench considered this. "Hello," it muttered under its breath, testing the word like it was a foreign concept. Then, with a deep creak, it turned toward the hydrangea and said, louder this time, "Hello." The hydrangea swayed a little closer, as though intrigued. I didn't stick around to watch the rest, but I left feeling oddly hopeful. By late afternoon, the sky had started to unravel, not in a scary way, but like someone was carefully pulling threads from an old tapestry to reveal something brighter underneath. The clouds weren't clouds anymore. They were great swaths of fabric, shimmering with colors I didn't have names for. As they unraveled, they revealed a second sky beneath the first, full of stars that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. A voice whispered in my ear, so close and soft that it felt like a secret being shared. "The first layer's always the most boring," it said. "We're just getting started." When I got home, the clock on my dresser was still deep in existential debate, but it paused long enough to greet me. "How was it out there?" it asked, its face tilted in what might have been curiosity. "Strange," I said, "but good." The clock nodded. "Time is strange, too," it said almost wistfully. "But sometimes it's good." As I climbed into bed, the moss on the floor hummed a gentle lullaby, and the stars outside twinkled in patterns that felt like they were just for me. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I wasn't worried. The world seemed to know what it was doing, even if I didn't. So, here's my question. If the world around you started breaking its own rules, not in chaos, but in a way that felt intentional and wondrous. How would you navigate it? Would you talk to the hydrangeas? Help the children build their glowing city? Or just let the world lead you, step by unexpected step? Let's start a new story. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not the usual muddle of sheets and faint detergent, but something sharper, greener. Like rain-soaked pine needles mixed with fresh citrus. I sat up groggily and found myself in a room that wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's, really, because the walls were trees. Massive, towering trees stretched upward, their branches forming an impossibly high ceiling woven with thick, glowing vines. The vines pulsed faintly, as though they were breathing light. My bed, if you could call it that, was a nest of oversized leaves, soft and cool against my skin. The air was crisp and alive, charged with an energy that buzzed at the edge of my awareness. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and immediately heard a voice, soft, lilting, and slightly amused. "Careful. It's rude to startle a floor." "What?" I mumbled, still groggy. The ground beneath me shifted, rising slightly, and I realized the floor wasn't a floor at all, but an enormous, glistening mushroom. Its surface rippled faintly, and a deep chuckle echoed through the space, as though it was pleased with my confusion. "Better," it said, its voice low and earthy, vibrating through my feet. I scrambled to stand, wobbling a little. "Where am I?" The mushroom hummed thoughtfully. "Not the sort of question you should waste on your first breath here. Try again." I stared at it, baffled, and then looked around the room, or forest, or whatever this was. I hadn't noticed before, but the trees were shifting, not swaying, but actually moving, their trunks twisting and rearranging themselves like a living puzzle. The vines overhead flickered brighter as they did, casting dapples of green light across everything. "What am I supposed to ask?" I tried. "Ah," the mushroom said approvingly. "Now that's a better question." Before it could answer, another voice cut in, crisp and musical, like a bell being struck underwater. "Don't bother with the mushroom. It loves to feel important." I turned to see a tall figure standing in the doorway, or what I assumed was a doorway. It was a gap between two trees, framed by hanging moss that seemed to part for them as they stepped through. The figure was humanoid, but just barely. Their skin shimmered like opal in moonlight, and their eyes were the unsettling, endless black of deep space. Their hair, if you could call it that, was a cascade of tiny, glowing orbs that floated gently around their head. "Who are you?" I asked, trying not to sound as awestruck as I felt. They smiled, and it was not at all comforting. "Names aren't necessary here, but you can call me whatever you need." "That's a lot to unpack," I muttered. "Then don't unpack it," they replied cheerfully, stepping closer. "You're here because you slipped through. It happens. Rare, but not unheard of." "Slipped through what?" The figure raised a hand, and a glowing sphere appeared in their palm. It expanded, becoming translucent, and inside I saw a blurry, shifting image of myself sleeping in my own bed. "There," they said, pointing. "That's where you were." "And this," they gestured around us, "is everything between the cracks." "The cracks of what?" "Reality," the mushroom said helpfully, its voice a rumbling undertone now. "Reality is riddled with cracks. It's what makes it interesting." I stared at the glowing orb, hypnotized by the image of myself. "So, how do I get back?" The figure tilted their head, their orbs of hair brightening slightly. "Why would you want to?" "What do you mean, why? That's my life." "Is it?" They waved their hand, and the orb disappeared. "Life is what happens to you. Here, you get to choose what happens. Isn't that better?" I wanted to argue, but my words caught in my throat. Something about this place, it felt familiar, not in the sense that I'd been here before, but as though it had always existed somewhere deep in my subconscious, waiting for me to notice it. "Come," they said, extending a hand. "Let me show you." I hesitated, but curiosity won out. When I took their hand, it was like grabbing a bolt of lightning. Not painful, but electrifying. The world around us shifted instantly, and we were standing on the edge of an enormous cliff. Below us stretched a vast ocean, but instead of water, It was filled with churning clouds, glowing softly like embers. "What is this place?" I whispered. They didn't answer. Instead, they released my hand and stepped forward, walking out onto the air above the ocean of clouds as though it were solid ground. They turned and beckoned to me, their smile widening. "Come," they said again. I stared at them, my heart pounding. Every instinct screamed that this was insane, but something deeper, something primal, urged me forward. I stepped off the cliff, expecting to fall, but the air held me like the earth itself. Each step sent ripples through the glowing clouds below, and the sensation was intoxicating, like the first deep breath of spring after a long winter. They led me across the sky to a massive structure that loomed in the distance, its shape constantly shifting as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. It was a castle, a tree, a mountain, a maze, all at once, and yet never fully any of them. "This is the heart of the in-between," they said as we approached. "If you step inside, you'll understand everything." "Understand what?" "Yourself," they replied simply. I hesitated at the threshold, my hand hovering over the shimmering surface of the ever-changing door. "And if I don't want to?" They shrugged, their smile faintly amused. "Then you can stay here, or go back to your before. The cracks don't force anyone. They only offer." I looked back at the glowing ocean, the impossible sky, and the shimmering forest in the distance. Then I looked at the orb in my guide's hand, where my sleeping form waited, still and peaceful. "What would you do?" I asked. The figure laughed, a sound that seemed to echo infinitely. "I am the cracks. I never choose." And so I stood there, caught between a door and a dream, wondering what I'd choose if you were me. What would you do? Let's start a new story. It began with a shadow, a flicker on the periphery of my vision, gone before I could turn my head. I was walking through the park at dusk, the kind of place that always feels like it's holding its breath between the end of one world and the start of another. The trees whispered, their leaves trembling under a sky bruised with violet and gold. I told myself it was nothing, probably a bird or a trick of the fading light. But then it happened again, and again. The third time, it wasn't a shadow but a sound, a low hum, like a note plucked from a string, resonating in the air around me. It wasn't coming from a direction I could pinpoint. It was just there, as if the whole park was vibrating with it. I stopped walking, and the hum stopped too. The silence that followed wasn't normal silence. It was thick, expectant, like the pause before a magician reveals their trick. And then I saw it. A door. It shouldn't have been there, not in the middle of the park, not standing upright and unsupported. It was old, carved from a wood so dark it looked black, with intricate patterns swirling across its surface. The handle was brass, shaped like an animal. No, like several animals all merging into one, their forms shifting depending on how I looked at it. I didn't touch it. Not yet. But I knew, somehow, that the door was waiting for me. I glanced around, half expecting someone else to be staring at it too, or maybe laughing at the absurdity of it all. But the park was empty, the world beyond the door impossibly distant, muffled as if by glass. My fingers hovered over the handle, my breath catching. The hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through my bones. I turned the handle and stepped through. It wasn't what I expected. It wasn't what anyone could expect. The world on the other side was vast and unending, a kaleidoscope of shifting landscapes. A desert stretched into a jungle that bled into an ocean that floated above me like a mirror, reflecting back the ground in impossible clarity. The air shimmered, thick with colors I didn't have names for. Paths wound through the terrain, but they weren't paths so much as suggestions, visible only when you started walking. A figure waited for me just beyond the threshold. They were tall and thin, draped in fabric that moved like smoke, their face obscured by a mask made of glass. When they spoke, it wasn't with words, but with the rhythm of the hum, now so loud and intricate it felt like a song. And yet I understood them perfectly. "You've come late," they said, the cadence both playful and chiding. "But not too late." "For what?" I asked, my voice sounding small in the vastness of the place. "For the game." They extended a hand, fingers long and pointed, and when I hesitated, their head tilted bird-like. "You opened the door. That means you're ready." "Ready for what?" They didn't answer. Instead, they gestured toward the landscape, and the paths flared to life. Threads of light weaving through the terrain, crisscrossing in ways that seemed to defy logic. "Choose," they said simply. I don't know why, but I understood. The paths weren't just paths. They were possibilities, fragments of futures and memories not yet made. Some shimmered with warmth, golden and inviting. Others pulsed darkly, their edges jagged and cold. I could feel them pulling at me, each one a different song trying to lure me into its rhythm. My feet moved without thinking, stepping onto a path that glowed, faintly silver. The figure nodded approvingly, their mask catching the strange light. "Good," they said. "That one's interesting." As I walked, the landscape around me began to shift. Trees unfurled from the ground like time-lapse footage, their branches twisting into impossible shapes. Creatures with eyes like lanterns flitted through the air, watching me, but never getting too close. I felt their curiosity, their amusement, like whispers brushing against my thoughts. The path wasn't straight. It coiled and looped, sometimes vanishing entirely, forcing me to trust that it would return. And it always did. At one point, the path led me to a bridge made of light. Beneath it, shadows writhed in a river that seemed alive, its currents murmuring secrets I couldn't quite make out. Halfway across, I saw my own reflection in the water, but it wasn't me. Not exactly. It was a version of me that looked older, wearier, but with eyes that burned like they knew something I didn't. "Keep going," my reflection said. Its voice wasn't mine either, but something deeper, layered with echoes. "You're almost there." I didn't ask where there was. I just kept walking, the hum growing louder with every step. The end of the path wasn't a destination, but a choice. 3 doors stood before me, each one different from the first. One was simple, wooden, with a brass keyhole. The second was sleek and metallic, glowing faintly at the edges. The third was made of nothing but light, its edges blurring into the air around it. The figure appeared beside me again, their presence like a shadow slipping into focus. "You can only choose once," they said. "But don't worry, you've already chosen." "What does that mean?" I asked, but they didn't answer. They just waited. I stood there for what felt like hours, the weight of the choice pressing against my chest. In the end, I reached for the door of light, its glow warm and inviting. As my hand touched it, the hum crescendoed, filling me with a sensation so vast and overwhelming I thought I might dissolve into it. And then I was back in the park. The sky was darker now, the trees still whispering in the breeze. The door was gone. In my hand was a single object, a key, its surface cool and smooth, etched with patterns that looked like stars. I didn't know what it unlocked, but I knew I'd find out. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but the hum was still there, faint but persistent, and I knew it would guide me when the time came. Have you ever felt like the world was trying to show you something just beyond the edge of your understanding? Something strange and infinite, waiting for you to step into it? Would you take the key if it found you? Let's start a new story. It was a Tuesday night, and the laundromat was humming with the sound of machines spinning and the occasional clang of a zipper against a drum. I was sitting on one of the hard plastic chairs, scrolling through my phone and pretending not to notice that one of my socks had vanished, probably forever. The place had a strange stillness despite the mechanical noise, like everyone was united in a silent agreement not to make eye contact. That is, until he walked in. The man looked like he'd just rolled out of bed, hair slightly mussed, wearing a hoodie that seemed more about utility than style. He was balancing a laundry basket on one knee while wrestling with a wad of quarters in his free hand. I glanced up briefly, just long enough to witness the inevitable. One wrong move, and the coins scattered like marbles across the linoleum floor. "Of course," he muttered, crouching to retrieve them. His exasperation was so audible it felt like a challenge not to laugh. "Classic laundromat initiation, right?" I said, before I could stop myself. He glanced over, surprised, then smiled. a sheepish, lopsided grin that somehow made him look less disheveled and more approachable. I was hoping to skip this part, but apparently, the washing gods demand a sacrifice. They're pretty unforgiving, I said, setting my phone down. Better luck next time. He chuckled, straightened up, and started feeding coins into a machine. You come here often? He asked, glancing at me sideways. The question caught me off guard. Not because it was particularly unusual, but because of the way he asked it, like he genuinely wanted to know and wasn't just filling space. Every Tuesday, I admitted. It's my thrilling weekly adventure. A regular, he said, nodding solemnly. I'm new here. Just moved into the neighborhood. Guess I should have scoped out a cooler laundromat. I smirked. You mean one with a DJ and bottle service? Exactly, he said, snapping his fingers as if I'd read his mind. Do they also fold your clothes for you at those places? They might, I said, shrugging. But then you'd miss out on the camaraderie of shared suffering. Touché. He hesitated, then added, I'm Liam, by the way. Grace. I replied, and before I knew it, we were talking. It started light. Why the vending machine only stocked the saddest snacks. How the chairs seemed specifically designed to make you question all your life choices. But gradually, the conversation deepened. I learned he worked in tech, but had a side hustle painting murals, which explained the streak of blue paint near his elbow. He told me he'd moved to the city for a fresh start, though he didn't elaborate on what he was leaving behind. In turn, I told him about my own semi-chaotic life. Working as a freelance writer, my quest to find the perfect chai latte, and the bizarre collection of postcards I'd been curating from thrift stores. It wasn't the kind of thing I usually shared with strangers, but something about Liam made it easy to talk. He listened with a kind of focused curiosity that felt rare, like he wasn't just waiting for his turn to speak. At some point, my washer beeped, breaking the spell. I stood up, suddenly aware of how much time had passed. I should probably move this to the dryer, I said, gesturing toward the machine. Right, he said, stepping back to let me pass. For a moment, I thought that would be the end of it, a pleasant but fleeting encounter. But as I opened the dryer door, he spoke again. Hey, Grace? I turned, and there it was, that split second of hesitation, where you could tell he was weighing whether to say whatever was on his mind. Would it be weird if I asked if he wanted to grab a coffee sometime? He said, rubbing the back of his neck like he wasn't sure if he'd overstepped. I blinked, surprised by how direct he was. Most people fumbled through a pretext or danced around the question, but Liam just asked. There was no pressure in his tone, just a quiet hopefulness that made it hard to say no. Still, I hesitated. I'd been burned before, by charming strangers who turned out to be less charming the moment real life kicked in. But then I looked at him, standing there with his paint-splattered hoodie and awkward grin, and something in me softened. Not weird, I said, surprising myself. But only if you promise not to spill your coffee everywhere. He grinned. Deal. We exchanged numbers, and he scribbled his name on a receipt he fished from his pocket, sliding it across the folding table like a secret message. I tucked it into my bag, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and disbelief. As I loaded my clothes into the dryer, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the start of something, or just another story to laugh about later. Either way, it felt good to say yes. When I looked up again, Liam was at his own dryer, headphones in, mouthing the words to a song I couldn't hear. And just like that, the laundromat didn't seem quite so mundane anymore. Let's start a new story. On the first of every month, just as the clock struck midnight, we'd step outside, barefoot and bleary-eyed, carrying a single mason jar. It didn't matter if it was freezing or sweltering, raining or calm, we always went. The mason jar wasn't special. It had once held spaghetti sauce, its faded label peeled off in a messy patchwork. But it became the centerpiece of something that felt almost mythical, something entirely our own. It started on a humid August night, back when we were still figuring each other out. We'd been lying on the couch, half watching some forgettable movie, when the power went out. Everything blinked to black, leaving us stunned in the sudden silence. She groaned, flopping dramatically onto the cushions. I laughed, mostly because her dramatics were always slightly over the top, but it was charming in a way I didn't yet have the words for. Let's go outside, I said, more to break the stillness than anything else. She hesitated but followed, grabbing the nearest thing, a mason jar from the counter, for reasons she couldn't explain later. The air outside was heavy, thick with the smell of wet grass and ozone. The stars above looked sharper, clearer without the usual haze of city lights. "What now?" she asked, holding the jar loosely like it might contain some answer. "Now," I said, grinning. "We catch the night." I meant it as a joke, but she took it seriously, snapping the jar shut with a decisive twist. "Got it," she said, holding it up as if she could see starlight trapped inside. And that's how it began. The next month, we did it again, this time on purpose. We waited until the clock ticked past 11:59, then crept outside with the same jar, now a little scratched but no less important. We stood there, barefoot in the cool grass, holding our breath as if the night could hear us. Then she'd pop the lid open and close it again, her expression half serious, half smiling. "Another piece of the night," she'd say, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Over time, the ritual grew its own rules. You couldn't just catch the night. You had to give something back. At first, we whispered silly things into the jar. Wishes, secrets, the lyrics to songs that reminded us of each other. But as the months passed, it turned into something deeper. One night, she whispered a memory from her childhood, something painful she'd never told anyone else. Another time, I confessed a fear I'd been carrying for years. The jar became a kind of confessional, a place to leave the pieces of ourselves that felt too fragile for the daylight. One January, the cold bit so hard our breath froze in the air, and I suggested skipping it. But she insisted. "The night still comes," she said, bundling herself in 3 layers and grabbing the jar. That night, I whispered, "I don't know what I'd do without this." She didn't answer, just squeezed my hand tightly, the kind of squeeze that says everything words can't. By the time we filled the jar, 12 months of nights caught and cataloged, we didn't know what to do with it. I wanted to open it right then, to spill its contents and see if all those whispers and memories would rise into the air like fireflies. But she stopped me. "Not yet," she said. Instead, we started again with a second jar, then a third. Each one marked a year of us. Storms we weathered, joys we celebrated, quiet nights when we simply stood together, letting the moment breathe. We didn't talk about it much, but the jars became our history, our language for things we couldn't say out loud. The first jar broke one summer, knocked off the counter during an argument we both hated ourselves for having. We stared at the shattered glass on the floor, the tiny slips of paper scattered like fallen leaves. "It's ruined," I said, feeling something in my chest crack alongside it. "No," she said softly, kneeling to pick up the pieces. "The night doesn't break. It just changes shape." We gathered the papers and placed them in a small wooden box. The jar was gone, but the pieces of the night were still there, still whole in their own way. Years later, when life pulled us in different directions, the jars became a map of who we'd been. I'd find myself holding one, unscrewing the lid to let the memory spill out. There were silly notes about our favorite snacks, tiny poems she'd scribbled, confessions of love written in shaky, late-night handwriting. They weren't just jars. They were us, captured in fragments of time. I haven't started a new jar. Maybe I will someday. But on the first of every month, I still step outside barefoot, letting the night wrap itself around me. I close my eyes and imagine the jar in my hands, the weight of all the moments we collected together. What about you? What rituals make your love unforgettable? Let's start a new story. It started with a knock at my door, 3 sharp raps, precise, like whoever was on the other side was measuring each tap for effect. The thing is, I live on the 5th floor of an apartment building with a locked main entrance, and no one buzzed. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hesitated, heart thumping, then peered through the peephole. No one was there. I opened the door slowly, half expecting a prank or a flyer delivery, but the hallway was empty. Almost. A small box sat on my welcome mat. It was plain, wrapped in brown paper, with no markings or return address. On top, there was a note in handwriting so elegant it looked like calligraphy. "For the one who waits. Open carefully." It didn't have my name. It didn't have anyone's name. Just that cryptic line. My first instinct was to leave it there. Maybe call the building manager to check for suspicious packages, but something about it felt too intentional. Like it was meant for me. So, naturally, I did what any reckless person in a mystery would do. I brought it inside. The box was heavier than it looked, and the paper was smooth but smelled faintly of salt water, like it had been carried by the sea. I opened it cautiously, half expecting glitter or confetti to explode in my face, but instead, I found a clock, or at least something that looked like one. It was beautiful but strange. The base was made of polished wood, its face a swirling, iridescent material that shimmered like mother of pearl. There were no numbers, only faint etchings of symbols, stars, moons, and other shapes I couldn't quite place. Instead of hands, a single black needle-like pointer rotated lazily, stopping now and then as if considering its next move. And then there was the second note, folded beneath the clock. Turn the dial, but only once. It must point where it wants to go. I stared at the clock, at the note, at my very normal apartment, now feeling like the backdrop to something distinctly not normal. But curiosity had sunk its hooks in me. I placed the clock on the coffee table and turned the small brass dial on its side. The needle spun violently, faster than it should have been able to, like it had come alive. Then it stopped, pointing to a symbol that looked like a jagged lightning bolt. That's when the hum began. It was faint at first, like the distant buzz of power lines, but it grew louder, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the air and my chest. The shimmer on the clock's face began to ripple, almost like water, and before I could decide whether to grab my phone or run, the needle jerked forward, and my apartment vanished. I don't mean it changed, or that I felt disoriented. I mean it was gone. The couch, the coffee table, the ceiling, all replaced by a sprawling desert under an indigo sky streaked with ribbons of light that moved like waves. The air smelled sharp and metallic, and the sand beneath my feet was cool, almost glassy. I looked down to find the clock still in my hands, its needle spinning wildly again, the face glowing faintly like it had absorbed the light around it. Ahead of me, something shimmered, a figure, distant but growing closer with each blink. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, as if the sand carried it forward. When it came into focus, I saw it wasn't a person. Not really. It had a humanoid shape, but was made of flickering golden threads, constantly unraveling and rewinding themselves. Its voice, when it spoke, was like wind chimes caught in a storm. "You've touched the clock," it said. "Do you know what that means?" "Not even a little," I managed to reply, though my throat felt dry. "It means you're moving now," it said, tilting its head as though studying me. "The waiting is over." I wanted to ask what I'd been waiting for, but the figure gestured toward the horizon, where strange structures loomed, spires made of what looked like liquid metal, twisting upward into the sky. "Every time you turn the dial, you choose a step," it said. "But steps are not always forward." The figure didn't wait for a response. It flickered once, and then pointed at the clock in my hand. Its needle had stopped again, this time on a shape that resembled an open eye. The hum returned, louder this time, and the sand around me began to shift, rising in spirals that sparkled like powdered gemstones. Before I could panic, the world folded in on itself, and I was somewhere else. This time it was a forest, but not like any I'd seen before. The trees were translucent, their branches glowing faintly from within, and the ground was covered in a soft, spongy moss that pulsed gently under my feet. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of water, though it was unlike any river I'd ever heard. It sounded melodic, almost like it was singing. The clock was still in my hands, but its needle was motionless now, and I couldn't find the dial. The shimmering figure appeared again, stepping from behind a tree that hadn't been there a moment ago. "You've turned once," it said, its tone unreadable. "That is enough for now." "What is this?" I asked, finally finding my voice. "What am I supposed to do?" "You already are," it said. "Everywhere you go, you leave ripples. Each turn of the clock rewrites the paths, yours and others. But remember, once a path is chosen, it cannot be undone." It stepped closer, its threads unspooling and weaving themselves again with each movement. "You can go back now," it said, and for the first time, its voice softened. "But the clock will remain with you, and it will always wait." Before I could ask what that meant, the hum began again, and the forest melted into my apartment. The clock sat on the coffee table, still and silent, its needle pointing to nothing. It's been weeks now. The clock hasn't moved, but sometimes when I touch it, I feel the faintest hum, like it's alive beneath my fingertips. I haven't turned the dial again. Not yet, but I keep catching myself staring at it, wondering what waits on the other side of its face. Wondering if I have the courage to turn it again. Let's start a new story. I didn't plan to break into the aquarium. It just sort of happened. The night started with an overpriced cocktail at a pretentious rooftop bar where I was supposed to be networking at some work event. Instead, I ended up awkwardly perched on the edge of a conversation about cryptocurrency, nodding as if I understood a single word. By the time I finished my drink, I decided I'd rather do anything else, so I left without telling anyone. Walking home through the cool, quiet streets, I saw it, the aquarium, looming dark and mysterious in the distance. I'd been there once as a kid on a school trip, but my most vivid memory was being scolded for sticking my hand in the stingray tank. Now, with the building closed and its neon sign buzzing faintly, it looked tempting. It wasn't a premeditated decision. One moment I was standing outside, staring at the locked gate, and the next I was climbing over it. To this day, I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the drink or the monotony of the evening or the fact that the world felt too predictable lately. Whatever it was, I hopped down on the other side, heart pounding with the kind of reckless excitement I hadn't felt in years. The door to the main entrance was, unsurprisingly, locked. But after circling the building, I found a side door with a simple push-bar latch. To my astonishment, it gave way with a groan, and I slipped inside, greeted by the scent of salt water and something faintly metallic. The aquarium at night was an entirely different world. The overhead lights were off, leaving only the tanks to glow faintly, their blue-green light casting rippling patterns across the floor. It was quiet, but not silent. The hum of pumps and the occasional splash of water echoed through the empty halls. I wandered past tanks filled with darting clownfish, ghostly jellyfish, and an enormous octopus that blinked one sleepy eye at me before curling deeper into its lair. I wasn't alone for long. I turned a corner near the shark tunnel and nearly screamed when I saw someone else standing there, staring into the glass. It was a woman, probably in her late 20s, with short-cropped hair dyed electric blue and a leather jacket that looked more expensive than my rent. She turned slowly when she heard me, her expression caught somewhere between suspicion and amusement. "Let me guess," she said, her voice low and smooth. "You couldn't resist either." I stammered something incoherent, and she laughed, a bright, genuine sound that immediately made me feel less like a trespasser and more like an accomplice. "I work here," she said, "but I'm off the clock. Sometimes I sneak in after hours. Best time to see the place." She tilted her head, studying me. "What's your excuse?" I said, feeling uncomfortably exposed. "Networking event was boring?" Her grin widened. "Fair enough. Want a tour?" And just like that, I had a guide to the underbelly of the aquarium. Her name was Rhea, and she knew the place like the back of her hand. She led me through exhibits that weren't on the public map, including a behind-the-scenes area where they raised baby sea turtles in shallow tanks. I got to feed a stingray, legally this time, and see the eerie, bioluminescent glow of deep-sea fish kept in a darkened corner like a secret. The highlight, though, was the shark tunnel. During the day, it was packed with tourists jostling for selfies, but now it was just us. Rhea sat cross-legged on the floor, and I joined her, staring up as sleek shadows glided overhead. The water refracted the light in strange ways, making the sharks look both alien and ancient, like they belonged to another time entirely. "Ever think about what it'd be like to be one of them?" Rhea asked suddenly, her voice echoing softly. "A shark?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "No," she said, smirking, "a person that doesn't have to explain to anyone why they broke into an aquarium." We laughed, and I realized I hadn't laughed like that in months. It felt good. Free. Eventually, the night caught up with us, and we made our way back to the side door. Before I left, Rhea handed me a laminated card with her name and a number on it. "In case you ever want a legal tour," she said, her tone teasing. As I climbed back over the gate and walked home, I felt lighter than I had in ages. The city was quiet, the streets empty, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt like I'd been let in on a secret, one I could carry with me no matter how mundane life got. The next morning, I found sand in my shoes and a faint saltwater smell clinging to my jacket. I smiled all through the boring work meeting, thinking about sharks and glowing fish and a stranger with blue hair who'd turned a stolen moment into a night I'd never forget. Have you ever stumbled into something wild and unplanned that made you feel alive in a way you didn't know you needed? Let's start a new story. I didn't mean to take the umbrella. It was one of those oversized black ones, the kind you see in old movies, leaning forgotten against the coat rack at the cafe. Outside, the rain was coming down so hard it blurred the city into a watercolor painting, and I was already late for the gallery opening I had promised to attend. In my defense, it looked abandoned. I grabbed it, muttering apologies to no one in particular, and stepped into the storm. The umbrella opened with a satisfying whoosh, big enough to shield me and maybe a second person. Had there been anyone foolish enough to be out in this weather? The gallery was only 3 blocks away, but by the time I got there, my shoes were soaked and my coat dripped in a way that made me self-conscious about stepping onto the pristine wooden floors. It wasn't a big event, just an opening for a local artist a friend of mine was trying to promote. Still, the room buzzed with that particular kind of energy you only find in spaces where people are pretending to know more about art than they do. I spotted the wine table immediately. Of course, a gallery on a rainy night serves free wine, and made a beeline for it, abandoning the umbrella near the entrance. As I sipped something vaguely red and vaguely dry, I turned to face the nearest painting. It was an abstract mess of bold slashes and chaotic colors, the kind of thing that either meant everything or nothing. "Looks like a crime scene," someone said beside me. I turned to see a man standing just far enough away to seem polite, but close enough that I knew the comment was meant for me. He was taller than me, with a slight tilt to his posture, like he didn't care enough to stand up straight. His hair was wet, suggesting he'd braved the same storm I had, but his smile was warm, almost conspiratorial. "An expensive crime scene," I replied. "Probably one of those art theft gone wrong situations." He laughed, a low, genuine sound that didn't feel rehearsed. "Maybe we're looking at the evidence." We stood there for a moment, pretending to study the painting, though I doubt either of us saw it anymore. "Do you come to these things often?" he asked, glancing sideways at me. "Only when guilt into it by friends," I said. "You?" "Not really." I was hiding from the rain. He gestured vaguely toward the door. The cafe across the street ran out of seats, so I wandered in here. I couldn't tell if he was joking, but the thought of someone stumbling into an art gallery as a form of weather shelter amused me. For the next hour, we drifted through the exhibit together, trading comments that hovered somewhere between sarcastic and sincere. He pointed out a sculpture that looked like it was made of melted spoons. I pretended to give an in-depth analysis of a series of photographs that featured close-ups of houseplants. At some point, he asked, "Do you always carry an umbrella that size, or are you planning to start a rescue service?" I froze. "Oh no, that's not mine." "Really?" He raised an eyebrow. "Because I'm pretty sure I saw you march in here with it like Mary Poppins." I winced, torn between embarrassment and laughter. "Fine, I borrowed it. It was abandoned, and it was raining." His grin widened. "Well, now I'm curious. Do you always borrow things in emergencies? Or is this a special occasion?" "Depends," I said, trying to sound mysterious. "Are you going to report me?" "Not if you let me borrow it next," he said, and before I could come up with a witty response, someone tapped my shoulder. It was my friend, the one who had dragged me here. "There you are," she said, giving me a look that suggested I'd been caught sneaking candy before dinner. "Have you met the artist?" "No," I admitted, but when I turned to introduce the stranger I'd been talking to, he was gone. The rest of the night passed in a blur of half-listened-to conversations and polite smiles. I didn't see him again, and by the time I was ready to leave, The rain had stopped, leaving the streets shiny and empty. As I grabbed the umbrella on my way out, I noticed something tucked into its handle, a folded napkin from the cafe across the street. Scribbled on it, in neat but hurried handwriting, was a note. "Thanks for the chat. If you ever want to borrow something else, find me at the cafe." For the first time in a while, I didn't rush home. Instead, I walked slowly, twirling the umbrella even though the sky was clearing. Something about the night felt incomplete, but in a good way, like a story with a perfect, open-ended last line. I kept the napkin, of course, and the umbrella too. You never know when you'll need to borrow something or someone again. Let's start a new story. There's a certain charm in the rituals of an ordinary day, a kind of predictable comfort. That's what I was counting on when I left my apartment that morning. My weekend plan was modest. Grab a bagel from the corner shop, settle in at the park with a book, and let the hours slip by quietly. Nothing wild, nothing noteworthy. The universe, it turned out, had other ideas. The first hiccup came when my usual bagel spot was unexpectedly closed. A hand-scrawled sign, taped to the window, read, "Back at 1. Life happens." I stood there for a moment, considering my options, and finally decided to wander down an unfamiliar side street, where I remembered seeing a cafe I'd never tried. The place was tucked between a laundromat and a locksmith, its sign hanging crookedly like it had given up on impressing anyone. Inside, it smelled like fresh bread and old books. I ordered a bagel and coffee from a woman who looked like she might have been part of the cafe itself. Her hair as wild as the ivy creeping along the walls, and sat at a table by the window. That's when I noticed the envelope. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just lying there under the salt shaker. A creamy white envelope, sealed with red wax, stamped with a symbol I didn't recognize. I glanced around, wondering if someone had left it behind. But the only other patron was a man in a corner booth, completely absorbed in sketching something on a napkin. After a moment's hesitation, I picked it up. The paper inside was thick, almost velvety. The note itself was written in looping, elegant handwriting. If you're reading this, it means you're curious. Good. Curiosity is the first step. Head to the Greenbridge Library. Find the blue book on the third shelf in the poetry section. Trust me, it didn't feel like a prank, at least not the kind I was used to. It felt deliberate, personal. My logical side argued that it was probably a marketing stunt or a misplaced letter meant for someone else. But something deeper tugged at me, something that whispered, "What's the harm?" I folded the note, pocketed it, and abandoned my half-eaten bagel. Greenbridge Library wasn't far. I'd passed it 100 times, but never gone in. It was one of those old libraries that felt untouched by time, the kind where the air seemed to hum with whispers of stories long forgotten. The poetry section was easy to find. Third shelf. A row of spines in varying shades of melancholy stared back at me. I scanned for a blue book, my heart thumping louder than the situation warranted. There it was, a small, nondescript volume with no title on the spine. I pulled it from the shelf and opened it to find another note tucked inside. "Good, you've made it this far. Now, go to the fountain in Elmwood Square. Bring the book. The pigeons will explain." The pigeons? I laughed out loud, earning a sharp glance from the librarian. But I was already hooked. I stuffed the book into my bag and headed to Elmwood Square. The square was busy with weekenders and street performers, the fountain gurgling cheerfully at the center. I circled it once, then again, feeling a little ridiculous. The pigeons were just pigeons, pecking at crumbs, bobbing their heads with no apparent wisdom to share. But as I sat on the edge of the fountain, flipping absently through the blue book, a flash of color caught my eye. One of the pigeons had something tied to its leg, a tiny scroll of paper secured with string. It pecked at the ground nonchalantly, as if it wasn't holding the next chapter of my mystery. I inched closer, crouching like a conspirator, and managed to slip the scroll from its leg before it fluttered away in a huff. My hands shook as I unrolled it. Final step. Head to 23 Meadow Lane. Tell them you're here for the story. Bring cookies if you can. Meadow Lane was across town, and I nearly turned back twice on the way there. What was I even doing? Following instructions from a stranger, like some live-action scavenger hunt? But every time doubt crept in, I thought about the handwriting on the first note, the wax seal, the way the universe seemed to be pulling me along by invisible strings. When I reached 23 Meadow Lane, I hesitated at the gate. It was a small house, unremarkable except for the string of lanterns glowing faintly along the porch. My knock was answered by a woman in her 40s with a wild mane of curls and a warm, bemused smile. "You made it," she said, as if we were old friends. "Did you bring cookies?" No, I didn't realize." I trailed off, feeling both foolish and exhilarated. She laughed and opened the door wider. "Come on in. You're just in time." The living room was packed with people of all ages, sprawled on mismatched furniture and cushions on the floor. At the center stood an elderly man holding a glass of wine, his eyes twinkling behind round spectacles. "Our latest guest," he announced, gesturing for me to sit. "Every stranger brings a new tale. The rules are simple. We tell stories. No names, no explanations, just stories. Tonight's theme is serendipity. Care to share?" I don't remember exactly what I said that night, but I do remember the feeling, the warmth of connection, the hum of shared laughter, the way strangers felt like kindred spirits. I learned later that the notes were written by the old man, a kind of elaborate fishing line cast into the city to draw in the curious and the brave. I left with no names, no promises of seeing anyone again, and yet I felt more connected to the world than I had in years. And as I walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, I couldn't help but smile. What started as an ordinary morning had turned into something extraordinary, as if the universe had decided to remind me how much magic still existed, waiting for someone to notice. Have you ever had a regular day suddenly turn into an unforgettable adventure? Let's start a new story. We weren't supposed to be there. Technically, the park was closed. The gates chained shut with a sign warning trespassers of hefty fines and overzealous security guards. But it was the first warm night of spring, and he had that grin, the kind that dared you to step just 1 inch past your comfort zone. So when he said, "Come on, I know a way in," I didn't hesitate for long. We slipped through a gap in the fence, ducking under low branches as the dark swallowed us whole. The air smelled of damp earth and budding leaves, and the only sound was the crunch of twigs beneath our feet. He led the way, holding back branches so they wouldn't snap in my face, his flashlight tucked into his back pocket but never turned on. "Light ruins the magic," he whispered, as if we might disturb some sleeping creature if we spoke too loudly. When we emerged into the clearing, I couldn't breathe for a moment. The lake stretched out before us, still and glassy, reflecting the stars like a portal to another world. On the far side, fireflies winked in and out of the darkness, their glow soft and fleeting, like the forest itself was blinking sleepily. He turned to me, his eyes catching the starlight, and said, "Wait here." Before I could ask what he was up to, he was gone, disappearing down a faint trail that wound toward the lake. I stayed where I was, the silence pressing in around me, until I saw him reappear at the water's edge. He was carrying something long and thin, a wooden pole with a net on the end. A moment later, he was knee-deep in the water, moving slowly, as if trying not to disturb the surface. What are you doing?" I called out, trying to stifle a laugh. He didn't answer right away, too focused on whatever delicate operation he was performing. When he finally turned back toward me, he was grinning like a kid with a secret. "Come closer," he said. I picked my way down the trail, half expecting him to have caught a fish or maybe just some slimy clump of weeds. But when I reached him, he held out the net, and inside was a tiny, squirming bundle of light, a firefly. "Why catch it if you're just going to let it go?" I asked, my voice soft despite myself. He shrugged. "Sometimes it's nice to see something up close before you let it slip away." I didn't know what to say to that. He crouched, dipping the net gently back into the water, and the firefly drifted out, its light pulsing faintly as it rejoined the night. We stood there for a while, side by side, watching the fireflies blink like scattered embers. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed my hand and tugged me toward the lake. "Your turn," he said, handing me the net. "I don't think I can do it," I protested. "I'll just scare them off." He stepped behind me, his hands warm as he guided mine on the pole. You've got this. Slow and steady. Like this. His voice was close to my ear, and I could feel his breath against my hair. I wanted to focus on the water, but it was impossible not to notice the way his hands felt. Steady, sure, like he wouldn't let me fail. And then somehow I did it. The net lifted out of the water, and there it was, a single firefly glowing faintly in the dark. I laughed, a breathless sound that felt bigger than the moment. He smiled, but there was something softer in his expression now, like he was watching not just the firefly, but me. See, he said quietly. Told you. We let it go together, the tips of our fingers brushing as the firefly drifted back into the night. Neither of us spoke for a while after that, content to let the silence fill the space between us. But when we finally started walking back toward the fence, he reached for my hand again, his grip firm and easy at the same time. At the gate, we hesitated, neither of us wanting to say goodbye just yet. Thanks for tonight, I said finally. For all of this. He grinned, but it was softer now, a little crooked. I thought you needed to see it. The magic doesn't last forever, you know. Gotta catch it while you can. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure I understood. Not until later, when I was lying in bed, staring at my ceiling and replaying every second of the night. That was when it hit me. It wasn't just about the fireflies. It was about the way he saw things. The beauty in the fleeting, the joy in letting go, and the quiet magic of sharing a moment that would never come again in quite the same way. I still think about that night sometimes, about the fireflies and the lake and the boy who taught me how to catch a little light and let it go. And every time I do, it feels like I'm holding on to something rare and beautiful, even if only for a moment. Have you ever had a date that felt like it belonged to another world? Let's start a new story. The first time I met Claire, she had blue paint in her hair and a mischievous grin on her face, as if she'd just gotten away with robbing a bank. We were 15, assigned as partners in an art class neither of us wanted to take. I told her I'd handle the brushwork if she did the cleanup. She agreed, only to accidentally spill an entire cup of water on me while trying to clean her brushes. That was Claire, chaos wrapped in charm. We've been inseparable ever since. 10 years later, the chaos hadn't diminished. We were sitting in her kitchen one night, eating cold pizza because neither of us could be bothered to heat it. The excuse for the night was her breakup. Some guy named Eric who liked to talk about cryptocurrency and wore loafers without socks. She was better off, and we both knew it. Still, she looked wrecked, her eyes red and puffy, her hair pulled back in a loose bun that was coming undone. I don't get it, she said, picking at a pepperoni slice. What's so hard about just being honest with someone? I didn't have an answer. Not for Eric, not for anyone. Instead, I said he's an idiot. His loss. Claire looked up at me, her brow furrowed. You always say that. But what if it's me? What if I'm the common denominator in all these failed relationships? I laughed. You? No. You're like perfect, in a chaotic hurricane sort of way. She smirked, but there was something in her eyes I couldn't quite read. You think so, huh? Yeah, I said too quickly. Of course. That was when I felt it, the shift. Like the air between us had thickened, charged with something unspoken. Claire stared at me, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. It was the kind of look that made you forget how to breathe. What if? She started, then stopped. She shook her head, laughing awkwardly. Never mind. What? I pressed. Say it. No, it's stupid. Claire, I said, leaning forward, my voice softer. Just say it. She hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of the pizza box. Then, without meeting my eyes, she said, what if the reason my relationships never work out is because I've been looking at the wrong people? I blinked. What do you mean? She looked up then, her cheeks flushed, her voice barely above a whisper. What if it's because I've been looking past you? The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I stared at her, my brain scrambling to make sense of what she'd just said. Claire, are you? She cut me off, her words rushing out like a flood. Forget it. I shouldn't have said anything. God, I don't even know what I'm saying. Ignore me. But I couldn't ignore her. Not when my chest felt like it was about to explode. I reached across the table and grabbed her hand, stopping her mid-ramble. Claire, stop. Please. She froze, her eyes wide. For a moment, we just sat there, the silence loud enough to drown out everything else. Then slowly I said, "You're not the only one who's been looking past someone." Her breath hitched. "You mean?" "Yeah," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "I mean, the kiss wasn't planned. It wasn't romantic, not in the way movies make it seem. It was clumsy and urgent, a decade's worth of unsaid things crashing into the space between us. When we pulled back, we were both out of breath, both a little stunned. "So," she said, her voice trembling but playful. "That happened." I laughed, a nervous, exhilarated sound. "Yeah, it did." The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. We tried to act normal, like nothing had changed, but everything had. The way she looked at me, the way I couldn't stop staring at her lips, the way our hands brushed when we passed each other and lingered just a second too long. It was intoxicating, terrifying, like holding a lit match in a room full of fireworks. One night, we found ourselves back in her kitchen, another pizza box between us. She was talking about some work drama, her hands gesturing wildly, her words spilling out in that fast, chaotic way of hers. I wasn't listening. Not really. I was too busy marveling at her. The way her eyes sparkled when she got excited. The way her laugh filled the room, warm and infectious. "Earth to you," she said, snapping her fingers in front of my face. "Where'd you go?" I smiled, leaning back in my chair. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how you're the best thing that's ever happened to me." Her expression softened, her cheeks turning pink. "You're such a sap. You love it." "Yeah," she said, her voice quieter now. "Ido." We still didn't have answers. We didn't know what we were or what we were becoming. But for the first time, it didn't matter. Because whatever this was, it felt like home. And with Claire, home was chaos. Beautiful, brilliant chaos.